Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing great. Welcome back to the Anime Fictions 2.0. Today, we're diving into part 4 of What If Naruto Konohas Lost Soul. One decision, one technique, and everything changes. If you enjoy alternate timelines and stories that push canon in unexpected directions, make sure to subscribe, share the video with your friends, and check out the other videos on the channel. And as always, drop your thoughts in the comments. I love reading your ideas. Now, without any more delay, let's jump straight into the story. Chapter 38, VOL 2, It Begins Anew. 9 years have passed since Uzumaki Naruto formally declared himself the Godame Hokage of Konoha, in which time, he has suppressed rebellions and uprisings within the recently conquered lands of Kuri, Kusa, Aim, Oto and Taki and stabilized his control around the area. His rule, though relatively short and naturally underestimated due to his youth, proved to be a prosperous one. Because of Konoha's rapid increase in power, territory and ninja force, their reputation also grew, and so clients came from everywhere in order to hire, which granted the region a substantial profit increase, allowing other projects which had been put off due to lack of economic support from the standing governments to be brought back to life. Also, because there was an almost assured cease of aggression between previously hostile regions, the checkpoints were removed, the roads were repaired, or built where there were previously none, granting free travel between the different countries. A relative sense of peace had been brought back to the region. In the remaining ninja villages, the situation was quite different though. In Suna, civil, military and political unrest continued to plague the region, and only recently had Gaara been able to gain any form of control of the situation. Rumors had it that it was because of some new council members that had been admitted in only 2 years earlier. In IWA, a status of high alert was present on the area at all times. The borders, checkpoints, supply routes and key bases were fully manned. Missions that were accepted were only accepted B class or higher. Very few C classes were accepted, if any, at any time, allowing the genin in the village to train and prepare themselves for the storm all knew would be coming. The Tsuchikage Yoshihiro himself looked over the training of every first-year genin and higher. No Chunin exams were hosted within the village, and anyone that wished to enter or exit the village was checked thoroughly before being granted their leave. Movements in Kumo had ceased almost entirely. No ninja had been reported leaving or entering their borders, and spies dressed as civilians with their chakra sealed who had entered the village had reported only possible sightings of ninja. From what could be gathered outside the village, missions were rarely taken and little to nothing was heard of the wreckage. It was as if the ninja of the region had suddenly dropped off the face of the earth, and all that was left were the echoes of ghosts. To most, this seemed to be the calm before the storm, and they were right. Naruto's ambitions of world peace through conquest would soon be reignited. He now had the money, the manpower, and the resources to go with his ambition, and soon the world will once again fear the demon of Konoha. The War Room is what this place was called. It was a room specifically designed for war councils. It was built as an extension of the Hokage Tower just 1 year after Naruto was formally declared the Godame Hokage of Konoha. The room was circular, about 35 feet in diameter. Dramatized portraits of the 4 previous Hokages hung from the walls. The Shodame as he stood, his hands in a simple seal which framed the necklace he once wore, which was now worn by his granddaughter Tsunade. A lush green forest was the background set for him. The Nidame stood with the Raijin in a ready stance atop a jagged rock, the waves of the ocean crashing behind him. Sandame, in his younger days wearing his classic battle armor and shinobi equipment, wielding his old summon, and friend Enma as flames danced around him. And finally the Yandame, an especially dramatized portrait where he held his trademark kunai in one hand, a Rasengan in the other, as he stood atop the head of the toad boss Gamabunta, which could be scarcely made out due to the red bumpy floor as he faced down the Kyubi no Kitun, its 9 tails in a seeming frenzy as its red eyes seemed to follow you as you walked past. There was a large red oak round table in the room, the center of which held a massive map of the continent. Twin mahogany doors barred the entrance. Currently gathered here were the familiar faces of many Konoha ninja. Mato Gai and his students Rock Lee and Tsukumi Tenten, the Hyuga clan head Hinata and her sister Hanabi, Hataki Kakashi, Yuhi Kurinai, the Toad Sanin Jiraiya, Kagai Kimimaro, Tayuya, Sakan, Jirobu, Kidamaru, Marino Ibiki, the newly instated clan head Abirame Shino, and finally, last but not least, Midorishi Enko. Mato Gai had changed little in 9 years. His eccentric nature, horrid clothing and ridiculously large eyebrows remained. In his mid to late 30s he was still considered one of the strongest ninjas in the village, and his still impeccable physical health showed it. Rock Lee, however, had changed some. Like his sensei, he still held the boisterous personality, youth preaching speeches and ridiculous training regimens. However, his choice in wardrobe had changed some, which was enforced by Tenten. He now wore a white Chinese-style shirt, with black loose-fitting pants and black shoes. His hair was no longer in a bowl cut, but was rather pulled back in a long braid which reached his mid-back. Now standing at 5'10", he was almost as tall as his sensei, and despite his somewhat embarrassing nature had his own little fan club. Tenten had not changed much over the years. She was now considered Konoha's #1 weapons expert and wielder, and anyone that chose to face her with one was almost certain to lose. She also wore a short cloak which reached her hips, with which she used to hide said weapons and scrolls. Underneath that she wore a long-sleeve form-fitting white shirt, along with a pair of dark black pants with white sandals. Between the fabrics lay a thin chain mesh which would help stop incoming kunai or slash attacks. At the age of 23 she was currently dating Lee. Hinata had also changed over the years. She had filled out nicely and was considered one of, if not the most attractive woman of her age group in all of Konoha. Unfortunately, she was also considered Konoha's resident ice queen. Her features, narrow and delicate as they were, hid a silent strength and determination within them. Her dark hair, which was only enhanced by her white clothing, reached her lower back as it hung freely. At 21, her experiences within the Hyuga house had hardened her and made her into a skilled politician and warrior. Hanabi had changed little in terms of appearance, except for the fact that she was now taller, more filled out, and wore mostly black clothing, a contrast to her sister. At the age of 17, she was considered a prodigy among her clan members. Hatake Kakashi, much like his arch-rival Madogai, had changed in little to no ways during the last 9 years. The only real visible difference on the man was a jagged scar that went down the right side of his face, which was mostly hidden beneath the mask. Yuhi Kurenai, the Genjutsu mistress of Konoha, had not changed at all in the 9 years, and despite her age of 36 didn't look a day over 28. Jiraiya, though his clothing and personality hadn't changed, one could now tell the various signs of his age as the years caught up with him. Once white teeth now sported a thin shade of yellow as the first signs of wrinkles began to sag his skin at the age of 59. He was also slower than he had been before. Having been diagnosed with arthritis at 54, the Toad Sage was beginning to have trouble forming hand seals as fast as he used to, but still enough to keep up with most of the younger ninja regardless. Kimimaro and other members of the Sound Four now wore green cloaks with different kanji for numbers 1 through 5 on them, written in dark red, and were now considered Konoha's elite bodyguard unit for high-paying clients and, of course, the Hokage. Marino Ibiki, like Jiraiya, also began to show signs of his age as he now had to walk with a cane and a slight limp due to an injury he received on a mission. At the age of 38, he was still considered the top interrogator within Konoha. For his appearance, he now sported a groomed beard which was beginning to show signs of gray. He still, however, wore the trench coat and bandana which identified him so well. Aburaim Shino, now head of the Aburaim clan, after his father Shibi died of a heart attack 7 months ago, wore a simple beige trench coat with a high collar. His hair was short. The glasses were still present, however, and the boy continued to remain the silent observer of the group. Midorishi Anko, though hardly changed at all. The massive doors opened slowly, silencing all conversations in the room as the Godame Hokage walked through. He stood at 6'2", the Kage robes and hat making him seem all the more regal and imposing than he already was. The slightly darker whisker marks identifying him as the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi scarred his cheeks. His slit blue eyes caught the eyes of all in the room before he spoke in the deep and commanding voice they had all become accustomed to. "Good, you are all here." Before he pulled out his chair and sat down, gesturing to the others to do the same. "Now let us begin this planning session." Sunigakure. The Godame Kazekage, Gaara, stood with his arms crossed and glaring at the closed door before him. The glaring red light of emergency stood out above the white double doors as nurses and doctors scurried about the hallway, rushing past him as they went to do their rounds. He wore white and rust-red robes. The hat with the kanji for wind sat proudly atop his full head of blood-red hair. Flanking him were the familiar forms of his sister, Sabaku Temari, and his friends, Inuzuka Kiba and Akimichi Chuji. For many years the former Konoha refugees had struggled and fought for Suna citizenship, and relatively recently, with some pulled strings from Gaara and his siblings, they had achieved it, also granting Inuzuka Hana, Akimichi Chuji, Naro Shikamaru and Yamanaka Ino positions on the councils of Suna as officially instated clans. They, of course, fully supported any decision to go to war against Konoha, and so now with their help the unrest had begun to stabilize after almost a full decade and most of Suna was ready to go to war should the need arise. But still most were fearful of beginning something they could not finish, especially now that the Kyuubi Jinchuriki seems to have calmed some during the recent years. "Hey buddy, don't worry about it. I'm sure Kankuro will be fine," Kiba said as he patted him on the back. The dog user had grown in the 9 years that had passed. Now standing at roughly 6'2", he was the tallest of the group. His messy mop of brown hair went down nearly beneath his shoulder blades. Akamaru had also grown, nearly to the size of a very healthy horse. Too big to enter the hospital. Kiba had grown stockier, putting on a few more muscles than what was commonly had in the shinobi world. He now wore 2 metal shoulder pads, leather belts crisscrossing his upper body which held sealing and summoning scrolls and specially designed blades which could be placed within Akamaru's mouth and shackled to his legs, which proved devastating for quick hit and run tactics. He also carried specially designed kunai which were enhanced with seals which converted his natural earth affinity into wind affinity. There were only 2 problems with that. One, after about 5 minutes of use they wore down and broke apart, and they were expensive. "Yeah," Chuji added. "He's a tough guy. I'm sure he'll walk out of that room once they're done," complaining about how long they took. Chuji now wore samurai-style armor, something that was hardly ever used in their line of work seeing as how cumbersome and heavy it is. But the hardened armor complemented Chuji's clan skills to the point where he had learned to work around it. His spiky gruff hair nearly reached his knees now as he held it all cropped back in a ponytail. Gaara and Temari allowed themselves some small smirks at the thought. They could see Kankuro doing something like that. Still, Kankuro's spinal column was injured badly in the last mission and the operation was a delicate one. If even one mistake was made, it was possible Kankuro's ninja career could very well be over. Hopefully it wouldn't come to that. Kankuro was infamous for his pranks, and being stuffed in Suna for the rest of his days would carve a horrible path of destruction that would be remembered for decades. Right, luckily Gaara was confident that if anyone could help Kankuro it was the 2 kunoichi in there right now, Ino and Sakura. They were 2 of the top medics of Suna, having studied under Chiyo, the puppeteer mistress and one of the finest medics Suna had ever produced. Unfortunately, Chiyo had died from her age years ago as she had begun teaching Sakura the beginnings of puppeteering. Kankuro, however, had taken up her training in the art as best he could. Her training in the puppeteer arts, however, was still nowhere near as good to match any truly advanced ninja for any real length of time. She couldn't match Kankuro in it, and she was a far cry from legendary puppeteers like Chiyo and Sasori of the Red Sands. But she more than made up for it with her medical techniques and skills in. Ino, however, had poured herself into her clan techniques, due to the fact that most of the Yamanaka clan techniques had been lost in what was now called the Great Konoha Massacre with the death of her father, and most of her relatives, unlike Chuji's and Shikamaru's. She had focused almost entirely on creating and honing personal techniques she created herself from scratch. Temari watched as her 2 friends tried to reassure them of Kankuro's impeccable physical condition with a small smile gracing her features. The years had certainly been kind to her, curves were in all the right places, tan skin and her signature 4 pig-tailed hairstyle made sure that every male in Suna knew who Sabaka no Temari was. She also made sure to let them know she was out of all their leagues. She now wore a simple, long-sleeved black top which left her stomach exposed. 2 slits went down either side of the strangely designed shirt, which reached her knees. She wore tight black pants beneath a long skirt which was cut open on the front, back and sides, which served to sometimes confuse an enemy in close combat. A belt with several kunai attached was around her waist, as well as one elegant yet wickedly curved dagger strapped to her ankle. The sound of clacking footsteps brought their attention behind them to the hallway, where they saw Hana and Shikamaru running towards them. "We just returned from the mission and heard what happened." Hana skidded to a stop next to them. "Is the troublesome idiot all right?" Shikamaru said as he lit his cigarette, only to have it batted out of his mouth by a ticked-off Temari. "We're in a hospital, jackass. The people here don't need lung cancer to add to their problems." Scoffing, he crossed his arms and in his signature display muttered, "Troublesome woman," only to receive a solid kick in the nuts for his efforts. He groaned before he crumpled to the floor in a heap. Every male in the room winced as they watched the shadow user groan and gasp for breath. He hadn't changed physically throughout the years, simply grew taller and sported a few more battle scars which were visible behind his signature fishnet clothing, as well as one large scar on the left side of his head. Hana also hadn't really changed, though she now sported a much more mature look and feel about her in comparison to the 17-year-old who had stumbled into Suna nearly a decade ago. She also carried herself in a much more guarded manner, something she had gained in her dealings with the council no doubt. Gaara ignored Shikamaru's pain and spoke to Hana. We don't really know anything at this point. Hopefully soon Sakura or Ino will be able to come out to give us some kind of news. As if waiting for the call of the Kazekage, the red light above the door turned off and the small creaks indicating its opening, revealing Sakura in her hospital garb. Her hair was now short, merely reaching her neck so as not to get in the way in either missions or delicate surgeries. Bloody smears adorned her form as she wiped the sweat off her brow. She looked up to the gathered crowd who each held their breath and smiled, softly, allowing them all to breathe a sigh of relief. She wiped her hands as she spoke. He's resting now, but he's likely to make a full recovery with some physical therapy. Gaara nodded, and one saw his shoulders visibly sag in relief. Thank you, Sakura. Can we see him now? Temari asked from behind her brother. She offered a small apologetic smile as she shook her head. Sorry, but he really needs his rest for now. Hopefully tomorrow he'll be well rested enough for us to allow you to go in and see him. Gaara nodded and sighed in something akin to exhaustion. Very well, you heard her. Everyone get back to work, God knows I have to. Temari smiled as her brother turned and strolled out the hallway back to his office. She would take him some lunch or something later, hopefully that would cheer him up. Kumogakure, Reikage residence. Juga Liang stood off to the side of his personal training field as Kumogakure's two resident Jinchurikis battled it out. He had not changed in the slightest with the passing of the years. He still looked exactly the same as he did 10 years ago, not one more wrinkle or scar or anything. Akina, however, had changed, no longer the young slip of a girl that had come, battered and exhausted from her encounters with her, as of yet unknown, brother. She now stood at 5 feet 8 inches and held a physique that could match any healthy kunoichi. Her form was lean and built for speed, agility, and flexibility. She wielded a 3-piece staff which could connect together to form a single 6-foot-long staff. She wore dark blue clothing. A long blue-sleeved shirt with slightly loose wrists. It parted at her navel, which however was covered in bandages. She wore light blue pants with a bright red cloth as a belt. It fit her loosely, with the end of it hanging down her side and reaching down to her calf. On her hips were 2 twin curved daggers, and on a leather belt which went over her right shoulder, and under her left arm was a small clasp in which she used to hang the staff from her back. Her control over the deadly force of Kyuubi's chakra had grown as well. She could now easily control 3 tails and keep them active for a solid 30 minutes. The 4th tail, however, continued to prove unstable, and all attempts so far at controlling the colossal level of chakra and bloodlust that came with it always ended in failure. He remembered the first time they had attempted to control that state, and he would never forget it, nor would many in Kumo. It had been nearly impossible to keep the incident under wraps, but he had managed with the help of his wife, apprentice, and Tsunade. Speaking of the slug, she had been key to his plans within Kumo so far. She was now leading the hospital and had been immensely helpful in keeping many of their nuns alive. Their manpower was growing every day because of her, and that was something they would need if they were to survive the coming fire. HAA. Lian watched as Yujito was sent tumbling to the floor from a solid swing which connected with her stomach, leaving her winded as she recovered and slipped back into her fighting stance. Yes, they would need every piece to win this game. Yoshihiro looked over some documents as he inspected the storehouse. So, we have enough grain to last us approximately how long here? Almost 5 months of Tsuchikage-sama. The man replied as he bowed to the larger man which easily towered over him. Yoshihiro was, despite his age of 68, he was still every bit as imposing as he was 10 years ago, easily towering over almost all of his subordinates as he stood at 6'5". He held his back straight, refusing to slouch forward as most men his age do. His tan skin and handlebar mustache and short ponytail was still in place. Yoshihiro held back a few coughs which threatened to escape his throat as he pounded his chest a few times before it cleared. Right, ration it as best you can. I got a feeling that soon enough we may be needing it. Naruto's eyes passed over all in the room, observing their somewhat grim gazes as they looked down onto the map which laid out their battle plan. Our enemy is at IWA. Chapter 39, Fear and Preparation. The agitated voice of the Kazekage echoed off the walls of the hallway and reached the ears of one Sabaka no Temari, as she made her way up the stairs to receive the mission she would be assigned today. Judging by Gaara's tone of voice, though, she would have to see what was wrong, though she most likely already knew. In the last few days, rumors among the high-ranking ninja had been circling that Konoha was again on the move, to where was still uncertain, but spies had supposedly reported massive troop movements along the borders and within the villages of Konoha, Aim, and Kusa. Hopefully they were wrong. But as she entered her brother's office and found several secretaries and messenger ninjas running in and out in what seemed like a panicked frenzy, she knew somewhere in the back of her mind that the rumors may just turn out to be more real than she would like. Gaara. Her voice was barely heard over the background noise, but the red-headed Kazekage snapped his gaze up to meet hers. She saw a grimness in his eyes and immediately knew the answer to her question. Temari. He spoke as he stood up, letting the papers he was holding fall listlessly onto his desk as he gestured to her to come over. She walked up next to him and watched as he leaned down to whisper something into her ear. Find Kiba, Sakura, Ino, Shikamaru, Chuji, and Hana and tell them to come to the Kazekage mansion at midnight tonight and make sure they are secretive about it. There's a mission of the utmost importance only they can accomplish. She nodded before she turned and walked out the door, the fear beginning to coil around her heart like a slithering snake. The demon of Konoha was returning. The doors to Hyuga's study room burst open as a young kunoichi barged in, her expression a mixture of anger, anticipation, and wariness. Is it true? She questioned as she marched up to the Reiki's desk. The man calmly looked up from his scroll as he looked at her and spoke. Is that true? Don't play stupid, master, you know exactly what I mean. Is it true that he's on the move again? She nearly growled, allowing her anger and frustration to seep into her voice. The Reikage rolled up his scroll before he stood and faced her fully. And even if it is a child, what concern is it of yours? She looked momentarily taken aback before she spoke again. What do you mean, what concern is it of mine? We've been preparing for nearly 10 years for when he makes his move again. Now he's finally made his move. And we will do nothing until the time is right. He interrupted her firmly before he walked around his desk and looked her dead in the eye. You are still not ready, Akina. Her teeth ground against each other in anger as she snarled. I've been training for so long, I've mastered my weapon, nearly mastered my lightning element, and have gained control of 3 full tails of Kyuubi's chakra. You said that he most likely can't use the Bijuu's chakra for long. If I'm still not ready after all this time, then damn it, when the hell will I be? She screamed the last part out as she pounded the desk in front of her with all her strength. The wood groaned and creaked in protest, and the right leg buckled and splintered from the force, allowing it to lean dangerously to one side. Hyuga watched her as she vented her frustration and remained silent as she continued speaking. Every day I see him in my dreams, as he kills them over and over. I hear his voice as he says that I'll always be too weak. I want it to end. I want. You desire revenge, but while you have been training, so has he. And unless you follow my instructions, Akina, you will never get your revenge upon him. Be patient, soon the time will come, but not yet. He watched as her shoulders shook from holding back her tears of frustration, anger, and acceptance of his words. Hyuga patted her once on the back before he straightened and silently left his office. His own preparations needed to be made now that Konoha was on the warpath again. He must be ready for when the time comes to execute his plans. Soon, Akina, very soon you shall have your revenge and we shall all have our new world. Yoshihiro barged into the council chambers, silencing the uproar of voices that had been squabbling and panicking as he did. He looked over the council members, several of whom were younger than him, before he spoke. All right, listen up, because I'll make this extremely quick. Konoha is reported to be advancing on our borders. We'll meet them at the only entry point Konoha now has into IWA and mount our defenses there. Apparently they've gathered a huge force against us and still have plenty in reserve to guard their borders. Therefore, we need every man, woman, and able ninja at our disposal, even yourselves if you're still able. One of the councilmen stood up when he was young, that Sachikage noticed before he spoke. Yoshihiro-sama, the scouts report that the enemy ninja number nearly 3,100 strong. Compared to our force, we have little chance of victory. We should send word for peace towards Konoha and attempt to stave this conflict before it starts. Yoshihiro snorted. Boy, sit down, I've led more wars and fought in more battles than the years you've lived, and I know from his previous actions any attempts at a peace talk will end in failure. He's powerful and ambitious, a deadly combination. Our only choice is a war of attrition." He looked to the rest of the council before he spoke again. "Now you are each expected to have your men ready to depart in 2 hours, otherwise it will be considered an act of treason and I will kill you myself. Good day." Before he turned and left as quickly as he had come, old as he was still not someone to be trifled with. As Yoshihiro exited the council room, he caught sight of his nephew Tohisa. The young man straightened as he saw his uncle approached and offered a smile in greeting. "Uncle, how did they meet?" He stopped as Yoshihiro took off his robe and tossed it over his shoulders before taking off his hat and placing it on his head. "You're in charge until I get back." It took him a moment to catch up with what his uncle had said. "What? Wait a minute, uncle!" he yelled, catching up to the man before he placed himself in front of him as he walked backwards. "What do you mean until you get back? I'm coming too." "No, you're not," the older man stated simply as he continued walking. "But uncle, I can't just sit by while." "How old is little Yuichiro now, Tohisa?" the tall man questioned, locking eyes with his nephew. The younger man paused for a moment at the unexpected inquiry towards his young daughter. "She's 3, uncles, you know that." "Wouldn't you like to be here when she becomes 4? The question made the young man pause as his uncle continued. "I have lived my life already and am proud to have seen you become the man that you are today. I'm sure your parents would have been too. You still have your life to live, let an old man sacrifice his if it's necessary." "But uncle, you're—" Yeah. Yoshihiro interrupted him with a wave of his hand. "Getting old, I know." He held back a few coughs in his chest before he swallowed and cleared his throat. "I am still the devil Shimizu, I know." The younger man sighed as Yoshihiro placed an arm on his shoulder before he spoke. "You'll do fine, kid. If anything happens to me, I leave you as the head of our clan, and I name you my successor as Tsuchikage. Understood?" Tohisa straightened before he placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly. "Yes, sir." Yoshihiro nodded before he walked past him. Shino watched as his ninja leapt silently through the forest. Naruto had appointed him as the commanding general for this attack. Hinata was his second in command and had left Hanabi back in Konoha to watch over the clan affairs while she was gone. Tenten and Lee were their respective lieutenants. While he was not overly concerned over their chances at victory, he was concerned over facing the Tsuchikage himself, the so-called Devil Shimizu. Apparently the man had fought in the IWA Konoha War nearly 30 years ago and had managed to defeat the Sandaime in single combat. While his age may have dulled some of his skills, he was still something to take notice of. Still, Naruto had entrusted the success of this invasion to him, and he would fight to the best of his abilities. Already he had requested additional forces from Kiri as a precaution and had received word that they would be sending Guan's apprentice Mika and his recently adopted son Toshiro. Indeed, if everything went as planned, IWA would soon be under their control. Gaara paced back and forth within his backyard, his eyes troubled and concerned as he waited for Temari and the others' arrival. He just couldn't believe it. Now, when he was just starting to get a handle over the proverbial mess Suna had become since the death of his father, this crap had to start up and kick up the hornet's nest all over again. Still, this time he would not sit idly by while the council debated like fools. He would do what he had to do to protect Suna. Just then the back door of the house creaked open, revealing Temari, Kiba, Hana, Shikamaru, Sakura, Chuji and Ino. Each of their faces looking grim with a silent, smoldering anger within their eyes. No doubt word had already reached their ears. "It's good you all came. As Temari probably told you, I have a very important mission for you." They each nodded silently, allowing him to continue. "This mission must be carried out with the utmost secrecy. Suna, as of yet, cannot be compromised in this, and should any of you be captured, I'm afraid no rescue from our part can be made. The need for secrecy is such that I will have to request you give in your headband the moment you choose to accept." "Come on, Gaara, what is it already?" Kiba growled in annoyance as his impatience got the better of him. Gaara looked straight at them. "Intelligence reports Konoha is advancing on IWA. The Tsuchikage, Yoshihiro Shimizu, is moving to meet them. You are to go and provide assistance to IWA in their fight against Konoha." Chapter 40. You Can Call Me the Devil. Naruto walked through the halls of his estate, the click-clack of his thick heavy boots echoing off the empty halls as the soft whistling of the blowing wind scattered the rotten leaves across the outer courtyard and porches, creating a soft yet somewhat grim and lonely melody as the silvery light of the moon peered down from the heavens. Books, statues, ancient tomes, weapons, armors, ningen tai and kenjutsu scrolls were the only company he had here, the only comforts, the only things he would ever truly have within these empty halls. A truly lonesome existence if there ever was one. But that mattered little to him really, even when he found himself dwelling on the thought. He entered his study and let his eyes travel to a carelessly discarded book on his floor. He walked forward and slowly knelt down to retrieve the fallen text. Placing it back in its proper place, he spoke. "Why are you here?" "I could ask you the same thing," Jiraiya said as he walked out of the deep shadows of the room, leaning on a cane he sometimes used to ease the burden on his bone-weary legs. It made it easier to underestimate how powerful he still was. "You've always led the armies up to now, what's changed? Why send Shino and Hinata?" "Unlike before, the elemental nations now know that we are a force to be truly reckoned with. The only reason we ourselves were not assaulted or invaded is because none of them wanted to start a fight they may not be able to finish if other nations do not join. Now that I have attacked one of the remaining two can try to seize the opportunity. I remain here to guard against such an occasion should the need arise. I do not believe Gaara of Suna or Zhuge Liang would attack while I am here." "That could be your ego speaking, Naruto. Don't let your self-assurance turn into arrogance," the Toad Sage warned. "Whatever you wish to call it, Jiraiya, the probability of them attacking while I am here and not far off in Iowa is definitely lower than it would be if I was actually gone." Jiraiya had to admit at least that, after all, who would want to take on the person who at the age of 13, almost single-handedly conquered 5 shinobi villages, 6 if you count Konoha itself. "Do you think they'll succeed?" "Nothing is certain, Jiraiya. You of all people should know this." Jiraiya nodded before he looked over to a large table in the center of the study. Piled atop it were dozens upon dozens of scrolls with different markings and seal patterns marked onto them. Jiraiya sighed. "You still haven't figured it out, have you?" Naruto drew his attention away from the current task of organizing the books of his study and onto the table before he walked towards it. Shifting through the old dusty scrolls, he spoke. "No, I have not." Over the years Naruto had been studying seals with Jiraiya's help. Together the two had tried to devise a process which would be able to keep the current aspects of his seal intact while also being able to channel and focus the demon's chakra properly, in essence fusing the characteristics of his seal and that of his still missing sister. So far the demon's chakra was too volatile, too chaotic and wild to control even the slightest. It was still as damaging now as it was then. Only his physical conditioning could really have any impact on how long he could control the chakra before it began destroying him from the inside out. Truly, Naruto had to admit that his father was a true master among seals, far surpassing Jiraiya and most likely any before him. It was yet another reason for finding his sister, apart from permanently removing her from the face of the earth, and subsequently returning Kyuubi to his part of the seal. He could also study her seal and perhaps modify his with her design. Still, it was a moot point. None of his spies had heard or seen hide nor hair of the girl since their short confrontation 9 years ago. The girl, along with Tsunade, had quite literally fallen off the face of the earth. Jiraiya watched as Naruto suddenly paused in his brief overlook over the old scrolls and got that look again. He knew that look well. It came every time he would think about his lost sister. The change in his eyes was a subtle thing. The slight edge and hardness that gripped them would be almost unrecognizable to anyone else but not to him. He was perceptive in his own way and has known the boy long enough to be able to pick up on his little subtleties here and there. The Toad Hermit sighed tiredly. Truly, the world of the shinobi was a tiring one, and sometimes he envied those that had died young. That old phrase of dying's easy had never been so true. Stepping back into the shadows of the room, the old hermit made his exit as silently as he had come. The silent group of 7 Suna ninjas sat around the crackling embers of a fire as they cooked some fish they had caught in a small stream nearby. Temari allowed her eyes to pass over each of them, taking in their expressions and their forms in a contemplative manner. Kiba was silent, a first from the dog ninja, staring into the fire with such intensity he seemed almost feral. With his fangs slightly peeking out from his lower lip and the claws lightly digging into his arms, the boy truly looked more like a beast than a human. Chuji was no better, his eyes smoldering with the promise of revenge for the death of his father. His jaw set in a firm tense line as he sat unmoving. It was truly strange to see the ever-happy and overall nice guy so hateful. It was the only word she could think of. Almost unnatural even. Shikamaru laid back, his expression in the same bored way it usually was, but she could see in his eyes as he looked up to the stars his own anticipation for the coming chance for revenge on the Konoha Jinchuriki. Sakura, while she did not share the same fire of hatred and revenge within her eyes as she did not lose as much to the Jinchuriki in the attack, the fire within her eyes was different. She was determined to help her friends. She wanted to help them get their revenge and find their own personal peace against the Konoha Nin. Hana was much like her brother, silent and cold. The Hakamaru triplets, her personal companions, growled lowly as they too felt her anger and pain. Kuramaru and Sim had been precious to them as well. Ino, however, was the worst of them. The bangs of her hair shadowed her eyes as her fists clenched. Possibly unconsciously, the brief glimpses she had taken into her normally warm blue eyes had left her stunned. Her eyes wore a deep dark hatred within them, even worse than the others. There was something truly evil within her gaze. Temari herself could only remember the fear. The fear she had felt when he had fought against Gaara. That unwavering terror, as he held his blade to her brother's throat, while she and Kankuro had been helpless to do anything to stop him. Those terrible red eyes that watched her from the blackness. It sent a chill down her spine every time she remembered. But she was Sabaku no Temari, and while she might be afraid she would sooner burn in hell before she allowed her friends to go to fight, while she sat idly by and did nothing. She would fight, and she would help them as best she could. The merchant city of Sakai was a large trading city. It was easily the richest, non-shinobi city in the elemental countries. The reason for their wealth was simple. It covered one of the major intersections of the shinobi world. If Suna, Kusa, Aim or Taki wished to arrive in Kumo, they had to pass through this city and vice versa. If Konoha or anybody besides Suna wanted to enter IWA, they had to pass right through here, as this was the only pass through the steep mountains. If IWA wanted to go to any other village, they had to pass through here. Half the city was located between the high jagged peaks of the canyons, offering it a natural defense. High towers, built on the rocks themselves, flanked the city, providing additional long-range supporting fire to ground troops through the use of flanking fire from the stone galleys. 3 stone walls that would each have to be breached before the city could be considered taken. Sakai was formally within the IWA territory, though they were mainly independent and relied on its sister city for almost nothing save for an annual fee and grant IWA control of its militia in times of war. Unless the city of Sakai fell, the conquest of IWA would never succeed. Shino ducked under an overhead swing from one of the soldiers before he swerved around the man coming up behind him, before he wrapped him in a headlock and stabbed him twice in the back with a kunai, before he pulled it out and threw it to another approaching soldier, catching him in the throat. The man gurgled and choked on his blood before he finally collapsed, dead. Shino then threw the warrior still in his grasp over the edge of the wall, letting him plummet to the floor below. The united Konoha army pushed forward, breaking the lines of the militia men and, up till now, few shinobi. Shino allowed himself to relax a moment before he spoke into his earpiece. Hinata Lee Tenten? How are things at your end? Yoshi have Shino cut off the connection. Obviously Lee had the situation under control. My men are moving towards the city gate, we're on schedule. I'm almost done with my side, we'll be able to assault the eastern wall soon. Also Shino, messengers are saying our reinforcements from Kiri should be arriving soon, in about another 30 minutes. Shino nodded. Very well, my men are already moving forward, we'll be able to link up with Lee and Hina. Shino's head suddenly snapped upwards as a massive shadow passed overhead. He barely made out the silhouette of a large man before. Crash! A massive cloud of dust and rubble obscured the area before Shino leapt out, flipping in mid-air before landing lightly on his feet. Looking into the dust cloud as it began to clear. Hey, damn, I really am getting old. 10 years ago that attack would have cleaved your skull wide open, kid. A rough, aged voice reached Shino's ears before the face of his attacker came into view. As the dust cleared, he came across the sight of a man in full battle armor, a large hammer slung over his shoulder, as he looked down on the Konoha ninja with a wide smirk over his face. Well now, boy, you can just call me the devil. Chapter 41, The Devil Unleashed. The devil? You are Yoshihiro Shimizu then? Yoshihiro's smirk only grew. I suppose I am. he replies as he settles into a heavily offense-oriented stance which Shino recognizes to have been used by many ninja that use large weapons, such as the Seven Swordsmen and some IWA nins who specialized in kenjutsu during the war. Shino adjusted his glasses further up his nose. It was the only warning Yoshihiro had before a swarm of Kikeichu converged behind him, forming one of the Aburame's signature clones who tried to plunge a kunai into the back of his skull. Shino watches as the older man catches the clone's movement from the corner of his eyes before he smirks, craning his neck to the side, evading the strike before he plunged the spike end of his hammer into the clone's gut, forcing the Kikeichu to disperse and return to Shino's body. Heh, if that's the best you got. I won't even need this old thing, he says as he straps the war hammer to his back. Shino again adjusts his glasses before he speaks. I see. Before he vanishes in another swarm of Kikeichu. Yoshihiro watches as hundreds of the pests swarm the air around him, creating a decent shade as their sheer numbers nearly block out the sun. Suddenly the bugs grouped together next to him and formed a near-solid mass that hit him square across the face, making the older man stumble back with a grunt followed by another mass of Kikeichu that hit him across the lower back, forcing him to stumble forward, nearly falling to the ground. Yoshihiro grunted before yet another mass of Kikeichu appeared slightly beneath him and slammed into his stomach, propelling him upwards enough to knock him flat on his back, 7 feet from his original position. The Kikai swarm hovered over him as the larger man let out a bellowing chuckle. He, not a bad kid. Yoshihiro compliments as he stands up fingering a kunai Shino from his hidden viewpoint recognized as his own. He had placed it so he would land on it when he fell. That would have taken out any common grunt pretty easily. But then again, I am far from common. Shino spun around in time to receive a fist straight to the face, knocking his shades off his nose and sending him careening through a second-story window and back into the courtyard where Yoshihiro had previously been standing. He looked up in time to see the original Yoshihiro melt into a pile of dirt and rocks. A clone? But I never even saw him make the hand seals. A shadow loomed over his form. Looking up, he saw Yoshihiro standing there with that same smirk on his face. Get up, brat. We're far from done yet. Shino, can you hear me? Hinata's eyes narrowed, getting nothing but static on her radio before she looked to the general direction she knew the bug user to be. Ten. Yeah. The weapon mistress answered back. I'll go see if Shino's in trouble. Press the attack, and if I don't report back in 20 minutes, pull the men back, get it? Wah, hey, wait a minute. Hinata turned off her radio before she pocketed it and made her way to the northeastern side of the city. Shino grunted as an armored fist buried itself deep within his gut, sending him skidding across the floor before he came to a stop, gripping his abdomen with one arm as he held a kunai defensively on the other. If there was any doubt about this man's skill before, there was certainly none now. While taijutsu had never been his strong point, and he admitted that that's basically all they had been using for this fight since he exposed his hiding place, the old man's moves should be clunky and slow due to the heavy armor. But he moved almost as easily as Lee did with the spandex. Not only that, but metal-covered fists hurt a lot more than normal. And that hammer on his back, while Shino hadn't really seen it in action apart from his initial attack, his Kikeichu were telling him that the weapon itself held some odd power, one that was not to be taken lightly. Yoshihiro cracked his neck, knuckles, and shoulder. Heh, I'm surprised you kept your lunch in your gut after that, brat. Most would have probably hacked up their spleen. Shino had to admit that too. He was still trying to get the air back into his lungs. Still, straightening his back, the bug user formed his hand seals before he extended his arms forward, and another swarm of Kikeichu headed for the Tsuchikage. Same old tricks? Yoshihiro smirked as he began forming his own hand seals for a. Only a finely tuned sixth sense gave him enough warning to lean back in time to avoid another Shino which came straight down from above with a kunai attempting to cleave his skull open, helmet and all. Before he hit the floor, he dispersed in another swarm of Kikeichu. Yoshihiro snapped his gaze up to the original swarm as it formed yet another Shino, with a claw-like appendage in the place of a right arm, reminiscent of a praying mantis which pierced the Tsuchikage's throat with a sickening wet slice. Only to have the older nin vanish and be replaced by a log before an earth spike appeared below and impaled the clone, dispersing the Kikeichu. Not bad, young one. Yoshihiro complimented as he looked to where the original Shino had been standing only to find it empty. An explosion from the ground to his right was the only warning he had in order to roll onto his side to avoid whatever attack the young bug user had used against him. He stood up, only for his helmet to fall off of his head, the small rope which held it there cut. Checking the area, he found a small dribble of blood along the side of his neck. Smirking, he looked upon Shino as the bug boy hovered above the ground in front of him. A pair of dragonfly-like wings formed by the Kikaichu on his back and one praying mantis-like appendage in replacement of his right arm, also formed by Kikaichu. Not bad at all, the old man repeated as his smirk only grew, gripping the hilt of the war hammer on his back with anticipation. Tenten's long straight sword dug deep into the man's stomach. The Konoha Jounin grunted before she pushed the blade with enough force to go completely through him, pulling upwards so as to open the wound more before she pulled it out. Turning on her heel, she twirled a kunai in her other hand before she threw it with expert accuracy through the crowd of rushing ally and enemy ninja, hitting her target, an IWA ninja's throat, dead center, stopping him from delivering the killing blow onto one of her fellow Konoha nins. Looking to her right, she found another of the militiamen approaching, his blade raised high in an aggressive stance. Twirling slightly to the side, she parried the man's downward strike so it passed behind her as she spun around, her own blade held so it went along her spine before she came around with a low swing, separating the man's leg from the rest of him. Taking out yet another kunai, the kunoichi buried it into the center of his back, piercing his spinal cord and killing him near instantly. She paused as she felt a strong pulse of what felt like Shino's chakra, followed shortly by a larger burst of another chakra she didn't recognize. She was brought out of her musings as she heard more approaching footsteps behind her. Taking out a double-bladed kunai from one of the many slots in her clothing, she turned, parrying the man's weapon before she brought the blade back, slitting his throat with ease before placing the weapon back in its place. Another massive crash and dust cloud spread throughout the courtyard. Shino's form could be seen as it rose above the cloud, the wings behind him moving rapidly in an attempt to lift him as fast as possible. The reason was soon revealed as a massive mud dragon followed his form shortly after, the armor-covered form of the Tsuchikage at its head. "What's wrong, brat?" Yoshihiro taunted as he blocked some hastily thrown kunai. Shino extended his free hand and another swarm of Kikaichu flew out of his wrists, latching onto the dragon, making it slowly crumble into nothingness as they ate the chakra that held it together. With a strong leap, Yoshihiro lunged for the bug user, his hammer raised in preparation to smash the Shino's head to bits. Swerving up and above, he appeared behind Yoshihiro, placing his hand on the man's back, forcing dozens of Kikaichu onto him. Soon, the purple-like armor turned brown, followed by the rest of him, revealing yet another Earth clone. Where did the bug user turned around, catching sight of Yoshihiro's war hammer heading straight for him. Swerving as best he could in order to dodge, the hammer still caught one of his wings, throwing him off balance as the Kikaichu struggled to reform quick enough. Yoshihiro would not allow him that chance, however, as a hail of kunai and shuriken assaulted Shino as he tried to reform his wing. The bug user blocked as best he could with his blade-like appendage and another kunai he had hastily drawn. It was not enough, however, as two kunai pierced his upper left thigh and his left bicep. Shino grunted before looking at the general building the kunai had come from. Before he threw some more of his own, these with explosive tags. With great blasts the tags went off, sending a minor shockwave through the area around him. Suddenly something slammed into his side, pushing the air right out of him, and he heard two distinct snaps from his rib area before he was sent careening into the side of a building and down to the floor. Shino coughed as he struggled to his knees, coughing up blood as searing pain shot through his chest. He looked up, finding Yoshihiro a few yards away, his hammer over his shoulder and signature smirk on his face. "Heh, well kid, it's been fun. But I gotta keep moving," the older man said as he raised the hammer over his head. "As the devil, let me be the one to send you off to hell." He yelled out the last part as he slammed the hammer down onto the floor. A trail of jagged earth spikes made their way towards Shino. The Konoha bug user tried to move, but the sheer burning agony any movement, even breathing, caused at this point halted him before he even made it to his feet. Two strong yet feminine arms wrapped around his chest and hauled him up away from the attack, forcing him to bite back a scream as the movement jostled his ribs. Yoshihiro smirked as he found an empty space where Shino's impaled form should have been. He let his eyes travel a bit more to the left, finding the new arrival of one Hyuga Hinata as she set her comrade down, well away from the action around them. "Hey, yeah? Been a while since I faced any of you guys." he said, placing the hammer back on his shoulder and straightening up, settling himself in a relaxed stance. Don't worry, Hinata whispered to the heavily breathing Shino. Leave it to me. As she moved to stand, Shino grabbed her sleeve, halting her. Be careful. I have the feeling he may have just been toying with me. Hinata nodded before she stood and faced her new opponent. Yoshihiro smirked. Now then, why don't I show you why they call me the devil? As he spoke these words, numerous eels glowed over the iron skin of his armor, revealing hundreds of tiny little patterns. Before the glow died down, Hinata noticed the chakra output increase quite a bit, as well as the faint green glow that now surrounded him. The smirk remained as he took his stance. Right, now let's see how well you do, girl. Chapter 42, Wet Behind the Ears. Yoshihiro smirked as he watched Hinata settle into the seemingly traditional Hyuga taijutsu stance. He did notice some slight differences between her stance and the normal Hyuga stance, having fought dozens of Hyuga during the war. Bastards had been a real pain in the ass and had devastated many squads during the opening days of the conflict. The Tsuchikage smirked as the girl's steady pale gaze settled onto his own eyes. Oh, he knew what she was trying to do. She was trying to read him, toy with his mind as most Hyugas did before and during the fight. Hid your confidence before they take you down completely and permanently. Hinata, however, found herself very surprised. The only thing she could see within the man before her was confidence, and a strange sort of contentness in his eyes. Always, no matter who her opponents were, in a life or death situation there was always the tiniest hint of fear. But in this one he showed no such thing. She could even say that he was excited about this. It was quite disconcerting to see such a thing. Yoshihiro's smirk widened as he watched the girl tense a little more. Of course he felt fear, every warrior did, it was human nature no matter who you were. There would always be that tiny little fear in the back of your mind, but his years in the war had served him well. When they had discovered the Hyuga's ability to read someone so well, almost all ninja were required to take a crash course on masking their emotions and feelings from them. It hadn't made any huge impact against the stronger of the Hyuga, but it did increase the survival rate of their nuns. After the war was over, he had continued to study how to mask his emotions. One of the best was to put up a front. You use 1, 2, 3, dozens, maybe even hundreds of different emotions to mask the one you do not want any to see. He was one of the few remaining ninja in Iowa alive who still knew how to do it. Shame, really. It was a useful tool even against non-Hyuga. Before any words could be said, Yoshihiro dashed forward, rushing the girl as he let out a battle cry, his hammer held in a ready position as he leaped high into the air, raising the heavy weapon over his head as he fell towards her, swinging his hammer to bring it down on her head. Before it made contact, the clan had leaped back, avoiding the weapon as it hit the floor before she rushed forward, delivering 3 quick strikes to Yoshihiro's chest armor, making the man stumble back. As she moved to deliver the 4th strike, Yoshihiro caught her wrist, smirking before he tossed her over his shoulder, intending to slam her into the floor, only to have Hinata right herself in mid-air so she landed on her feet. She caught Yoshihiro's slightly surprised gaze before she leaped up, delivering a solid knee strike to the man's face. She cursed as she forgot to add chakra to that attack, but made up for it as she delivered 4 more strikes to the man's chest. He should be having some trouble breathing at this point. Landing on her feet, she turned and watched as Yoshihiro struggled to stand. Coughing up blood, the old man gripped his chest as he stood. Damn, how the hell could a kid like you be this strong? Even I can't be this old. Hinata again settled herself in her taijutsu stance. I'm afraid you are in my field of divination, she exclaimed before the veins around her eyes bulged as she activated the legendary Byakugan bloodline. Moving at incredible speeds, she was upon the older man before he even knew it. 2 palms! She cried out, striking him twice in the chest. 4 palms, 4 more strikes to the upper arm. 8 palms, 8 strikes to the lower arms and hands. 16 palms, 16 strikes to the hips and knees. 32 palms, 32 strikes to the stomach and pelvic area. 64 palms, 62 strikes to the chest. 128 palms. She yelled as she prepared to deliver the final kata, which would hit each and every one of the tenketsu of his chakra system throughout his body. As she did so, however, she missed the old man's smirk. Something she immediately regretted as the Tsuchikage suddenly lashed out with his hammer, too quickly for her to react as he delivered 3 quick strikes to her left arm. shattering nearly every bone through the length of her limb. Screaming in raw pain as the burning agony raced up and down her arm, Hinata still had enough sense of mind to leap back, away from the older man and nearer to Shino, who was now trying to stand back up, seeing as how his teammate and fellow clan head was now in as much trouble as he was. "Wahao?" she gasped out as best she could as she struggled not to throw up from the sheer pain in her arm as blood began to seep through the white cloth of her battle robe. "How I wasn't affected by your hack," Yoshihiro completed for her as he smirked. "Simple. Don't you remember at the very start of our fight, when you rescued the bug user over there? My armor glowed green girly." He smiled. "That was me activating the special seals this armor has. I designed it myself. We Shimizu have always been prided as armor and weapon makers. Using some special chakra techniques and some seals of our own design, I made this armor to protect, at least partially, from all chakra-absorbing and chakra-based techniques. It would take a decent amount of chakra for a non-elemental chakra to affect me through this armor. Your clan taijutsu uses so little chakra I can barely feel it on my skin." "Do you mean to tell me that you haven't been affected by any of my attacks from the start?" Hinata gasped out, breathing heavily. "That's right, I wanted to get you overconfident, sure of your victory, in order to give me the chance to get a quick strike that would make this relatively easy for me. But, the blood." "This?" Yoshihiro said, reaching into his mouth, pulling out a small plastic object, clearly torn open and clearly having held blood at one point. "Great for making the enemy think you're down and out." Hinata's eyes narrowed in anger. Fooled by such a simple trick. She should have focused more, seen the state of his lungs and heart before she attacked. But indeed she had let down her guard, and now she was paying for it. Shino stood up, biting back a groan of pain as he felt his broken ribs scrape against each other. A nauseating feeling churned his stomach and fire spread across his chest. He would have to be careful. If one of those ribs punctured a lung, the chances were very slim that he would be able to get to a competent medic in time, especially here in the field. Yoshihiro's smirk widened as he watched Shino struggle to get to the girl's side. "Heh. You two sure could be great. With a bit more experience you could have beaten me. But you were still wet behind the ears." He hefted his hammer and rushed them. Shino formed his Kikaichu into wings again before he lifted Hinata up to the sky. Stopping mid-charge, Yoshihiro looked up as Shino spun around before he threw Hinata towards him. The girl, in mid-accent, had tied some ninja wire around her to keep her broken arm from moving as it pinned it to her body. Yoshihiro's stance tightened, preparing for whatever attack she could deliver. At the last possible second, Hinata started spinning rapidly in mid-air. Yoshihiro's eyes widened in momentary shock before he grabbed the earth in front of him, and with a heave pulled it upwards, forming a foot-thick earth wall. "Kaiten!" the young girl yelled as the spinning vortex of chakra formed around her, smashing against the earth wall, creating a mass dust cloud. Yoshihiro's form could be seen as he leapt up over the debris. His hammer strapped to his back, the man formed his hand seals, holding out his two hands as if he was gripping a large ball. Slowly stones and pieces of rock gathered there in a tight ball before flames consumed it, dancing across the hard shell. "Insei no Hametsu!" he yelled before he threw the fireball down towards his previous position, creating yet another explosion which shook the area around them with its intensity. A small crash was heard before Hinata flew out of the dust cloud, her clothes singed and burnt in several places, a nasty gash across her forehead as she skidded across the floor. Yoshihiro smirked, but it quickly died as he heard a faint buzzing sound. Craning his neck behind him, he caught sight of Shino as the younger ninja dived towards him in a free fall, the Kikaichu forming on his arms, forming the praying mantis-like limbs again. Yoshihiro cursed. There was no way he would be able to dodge in mid-air. Shino fought his way through the haze of pain and the burning in his chest as he plunged the two blade-like extensions into Yoshihiro's back, going completely through and through, puncturing the older man's left lung and his stomach. His Kikaichu crawled all over the man's armor like ants on a lion as they worked to eat up his chakra as quickly as possible. Shino would have sighed in relief if only he hadn't caught Yoshihiro's smirk. He went to pull back, but before he could, the older man delivered a brutal elbow into the younger boy's chest. If Shino thought he had felt pain before, it was absolutely nothing compared to the agony he felt flaring across his body now. The pain was dizzying. His vision swam before he felt another impact, barely registered in his pain-clouded mind. As his Kikaichu dispersed, and he began his free fall back down towards the earth. He saw the Yoshihiro he had just stabbed crumble to dust. Another mud clone, he thought before he hit the floor headfirst with a sickening crack. Shino! Hinata gasped worriedly as she struggled to stand. Another crack to her right drew her attention back to the dust cloud as it began to settle, revealing an earth dome as it slowly crumbled, revealing the real Yoshihiro, and at once Hinata realized what had happened. He had formed the first earth wall to stop her attack, then he had formed a clone to leap out, knowing that Shino was still hovering above them. Then when the clone had used that explosive attack, he had formed the dome in order to protect himself from his own attack and stay in the dust cloud. She hadn't noticed because the Kaiten had momentarily blinded her, as well as the follow-up attack he had delivered with the clone. "You two are really very good," Yoshihiro said as he walked out of the crumbling dome. Looking at Hinata's angry face, he sighed. "Don't get mad, kid. Like I said, I'm just more experienced than you, and with that comes a few more tricks up my sleeve than what you got." Hinata glared heatedly at him. Yoshihiro moved to shift his hammer back into a fighting stance when he suddenly turned and caught a kunai between his fingers. Looking to the rooftops, both Hinata and Yoshihiro caught sight of Lee and Tenten. Yoshihiro looked at the kunai in his hand before he tossed it back to Tenten. "Not bad, but like these two, you're still wet behind the ears." Tenten caught the kunai before she and Lee leapt down, placing themselves between Hinata and Shino. Yoshihiro moved to settle himself back into his fighting stance when there was an explosion that rocked the second wall of the city they were currently laying siege to. That would be the rest of the IWA Nins arriving now. Yoshihiro spoke before he looked at the 4 Konoha Nins. "I suggest you pull your men back. There's been enough fighting and death for one day." The older man strapped his hammer onto his back before he turned and began leaving the courtyard. "Wait!" Tenten called behind him. "What is this? You're just gonna walk away? That simple?" Yoshihiro craned his neck back to look at her from the corner of his eyes before he snorted. Wet behind the ears, he sighed before he yelled loud enough for her to hear. "Go home, kids, tomorrow's another day." Why Tenten called but was cut off as Lee placed his hand on her shoulder to hold her back. She watched him shake his head before he moved to pick up Shino. She looked back to Yoshihiro's retreating form before she sheathed her weapons and went to help the injured Hinata. Later that night, Sakai, IWA encampment. The merry cheering of dozens of Iowa nuns could be heard as they all gathered around several bonfires around the main courtyard of the city. Music was playing from the side, to which some of the ninja and kunoichi danced too. Yoshihiro sat cross-legged a few feet away from the fire as his men laughed, ate, and drank around him in celebration of their victory. While the casualties to the resident militia had been relatively high, as well as the casualties to the minuscule Nin force of the city, they had managed to deal a heavy blow to the Konoha Nins, in morale at least. 2 of their commanding officers were utterly defeated by him, single-handedly, and had been forced to retreat with the arrival of the main IWA forces. Indeed, morale in his camp had skyrocketed. "My lord!" A voice drew him away from his musings. Looking off to his right, he found a somewhat tipsy ninja as he raised his wine jug up high. "A toast!" he yelled over the crowd. "To Yoshihiro-sama, the greatest Setsukage to ever lead us into battle." Cheers of agreement were heard before the music and dance began anew, as well as the celebration. Yoshihiro chuckled lightly at the younger man's praise before he drank from his own bottle. Still, he was no fool. Those kids were good, but like he had said, they were wet behind the ears. The boy Naruto would soon send another, more experienced ninja against him. And they would not be so easy to defeat, they may even force him to use his clan's special ability. He was brought out of his thoughts as a somewhat panicked voice reached his ears. Looking to his left, he found a young chunin, probably no older than 15, running through the crowd towards him. As he reached him, Yoshihiro held up a hand. "Calm down, boy, catch your breath and tell me what's wrong?" he said before he took a quick drink. The young man took a deep breath and calmed himself as best he could before he spoke. "Yoshihiro-sama, at the gates, 7 rogue nuns have come stating that they wish to meet you in private. It's probably one of those Konoha fools trying to play a trick on us." One of the chunin spoke up before he bowed to Yoshihiro. "My lord, allow me to kill them now so they trouble you no longer," the man said with a humble lowering of his head. Yoshihiro waved his hand as he stood. No, I'll go see what they want. Besides, if it's a fight they want, well, I really wouldn't want to disappoint them." But my lord! Some of the men cried in protest. Bah, I'm not that old yet, kids, he said, waving his hand in dismissal of their worries before he made his way to the gate. When he arrived, he found 7 ninjas each in brown hooded cloaks along with 4 large wolf-like dogs, bowing as several of his IWA umbu stood around them. His heavy footsteps rang methodically throughout the courtyard before he stopped in front of the 7 nuns. Speak, he commanded. The one in the front unrolled a scroll before him. His men tensed and gripped their weapons, expecting some form of trap. When the scroll unrolled, however, there was just the seal of the Kazakage at the bottom of the unrolled scroll. Yoshihiro looked at the unrolled scroll at his feet and looked to the bowed, now identified Sunanin. What's this? A strong, sure female voice rang out from the one that had unrolled the scroll. The Kazakage has sent us to provide assistance to you. We are all of Jounin rank and are competent in field combat, stealth, and scouting. We are willing to serve you loyally until the duration of this mission in exchange for your silence of our participation in this battle. Yoshihiro smirked. So Suna doesn't want to put its foot down, lest it step in a great pile of crap, eh? Silence. Yoshihiro chuckled, amused by these old tactics before he stepped forward. Pulling back their hoods, it revealed a girl with pink hair, a kid with some red markings on his cheeks, another girl with similar markings, a pale blonde-haired girl with blue eyes, a large boy with swirls on his cheeks, a scared regular-looking kid, and finally a blonde girl with 4 pigtails. Looking over each of the neens, a smirk grew on his lips before a low chuckle escaped his lips. Eventually his chuckles turned into roars of uproarious laughter. The young group of Sunanins each glanced at each other somewhat nervously before his laughter died down. Smirking down on them, he rolled up the scroll before holding it up for them to see. Then with a small flare of chakra the scroll was consumed in flames before he threw it down to the floor. The smirk still firmly on his lips as he looked at each of them over one more time. Welcome to Sakai, brats. He chuckled again before he turned and left. 3 days later, Konohagakure no Sato. Naruto sat in his office, Guan and Jinchiko standing before him. They were giving their monthly report over the economic, military, and political situations in Kiri. So far everything was going as it usually did, except for a few minor economic drawbacks. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Naruto placed the file down onto the desk as he looked at Jinchiko and Guan. The two had not changed much over the years. Jinchiko's short cropped hair had grown out some, now reaching her shoulders, but apart from that little else had changed. The same with Guan, the man's long beard had grown longer as well as a few battle scars that adorned his uncovered right arm. Naruto did have to admit, however, that these two had become some of his more valuable generals in times of war. They had proved themselves time and time again, saving others like Kakashi and even Jiraiya himself on one occasion. He nodded to the pair. Very well, you may stay in Konoha today. Tomorrow you may return to Kiri at your leisure. Once you arrive you are to. The door to his office burst open, revealing a Chunin messenger who bowed as he quickly handed him a sealed scroll. Naruto broke the wax seal over the scroll and unrolled it, allowing his eyes to travel over the contents within. They narrowed in annoyance and anger before he set the scroll down. A slightly contemplative look entered his eyes before he looked to the messenger. Bring me Hatake Kakashi. The man bowed before he hastily left the room. Naruto then looked at Guan and Jinchiko. There has been a slight change of plan. Chapter 43, Dreams. Tanten-Lee and Hinata, whose wounded arm was currently wrapped from wrist to shoulder in bandages, stood inside of the medic's tent looking over an unconscious Shino. The medic had reported that he had a concussion, most likely due to the fall, 3 fractured ribs, a punctured lung because of them, as well as some internal bleeding along his abdominal region. Overall, the situation was not pretty. 2 others stood in the room, Guan's apprentice Mika, and the man's adopted son Toshiro. Mika had changed little over the years. Pale silver hair still hung freely reaching her lower back, red eyes gleaming with veiled madness. She had changed her blue clothing and now wore much darker clothes. A long-sleeved black shirt with a high collar and black pants that accented her figure nicely. Her Kiri forehead protector with a purple cloth was used as a belt. Toshiro was a young man about their age. A beard which reminded Shino and Hinata of one currently comatose Sarutobi Asuma decorated his face. Strapped to his sides were 2 single-handed tomahawk-style axes as well as several sealing scrolls. The two had arrived shortly after Shino and Hinata's defeat at the hands of the Tsuchikage, and had helped in assaulting and holding off the IWA Nins from that point out as the two healed. All assaults they had launched against the city walls each ended in failure. The Tsuchikage always brought his men back from the brink of defeat. Also, some reports from the battlefield were somewhat disturbing. Apparently there were ninja on the field that had been seen using techniques native to Konoha and their clans. Still, the reply that had come back from Konoha after their request for reinforcements was an uplift. Naruto would be sending Guan and Kakashi as reinforcements in order to deal with Yoshihiro, leaving Tenten, Lee, Toshiro, Mika and Hinata, if she felt up to it, to lead the army in its attack relatively unhindered. With two veterans and skilled nuns like Hataki and Guan coming to their aid, morale among the Konoha Nins remained relatively high in spite of their failure to take the merchant city of Sakai. Why not? It was the cry of anger from one Kumo kunoichi named Akina as she glared at her sensei and leader, the Raikage. Angry Sapphire clashed with emotionless Onyx. In a steady, even voice the Raikage replied, "It's not time yet, Akina. That's what you've been saying since this whole thing started. When the fuck will this elusive time of yours coming?" She questioned, her voice coming out as a low growl of agitation and frustration as her eyes tinted red at the edges. Tsunade, who was also in the room, tensed slightly at the feel of the Kyuubi's chakra. Though she trusted Akina, the subject of Naruto had always been a delicate one around the girl. Like carrying a lit match in a room full of gunpowder. Shuga calmly served himself some tea from the kettle before he spoke. "I have made my decision, Akina. The subject is closed. He's already attacked IWA. If we attack him now, he'll have to deal with two of the hidden villages at once, and once Suna sees him loosing, they'll undoubtedly join in too. Why the hell are you holding back like this, senpai?" she questioned as her eyes gave into the red creeping into them. Shuga stood and with a flare of his chakra spoke in a tone that left no room for argument whatsoever. "I said the conversation is closed and that's final, Akina." The girl stepped back slightly, the sight of her sensei's normally emotionless features tight with restrained anger startling her for a moment. She opened her mouth as if to speak again but instead let out a sound of frustration and stormed out the room. With a sigh, Shuga fell back to his chair, rubbing his forehead to stave off a coming headache. Tsunade walked and sat down on the chair in front of his desk and spoke. "I must admit, I too am beginning to wonder just when this right time of yours is coming, or if it's here and you just haven't noticed yet." Shuga sighed and spoke. "Yoshihiro Shimazu, despite his age, is far above the skills of almost all of Naruto's retainers, except perhaps Jiraiya. Suna has also lent their assistance, however discreetly, to him as well. What will happen is simple. Yoshihiro will defeat all that Naruto sends after him. At that point, Naruto himself will grow frustrated and march on to IWA itself, leaving Konoha relatively open to attack. That is when we will strike." "Aren't you placing too much faith in this Tsuchikage Juga? He could always fail, even if you don't know everything." Juga nodded. "I realize that, which is why I have a backup plan in case the unlikely scenario that Yoshihiro is defeated comes into play," he started calmly. Tsunade sighed and shook her head. "Wouldn't it be easier to simply tell her that rather than be cryptic when the time is right? She deserves to know at least what you're planning." Juga shook his head. "While her insistence on the matter would no doubt drop if I told her, she is impetuous and reckless, especially when it concerns anything involving Naruto." The older woman shook her head and sighed. "Sometimes, Juga, sometimes I wonder if you're worse than he is with how coldly you manipulate those under you." "The ends justify the means, Tsunade." He spoke as he took a sip of his tea. "That's what he would say, Liang." She spoke over her shoulder before she left the room, leaving the Raikage to his own devices. Yujito watched from a distance as Akina pounded away at a training post, using kicks and punches in a near-wild display. Blue chakra covered her fists along with the occasional wisps of red as she punched the post again and again. Cracks began to form along the post, as slivers dug into her flesh, allowing thin trails of blood to flow down her fists and legs. She ignored these, however, and instead focused on releasing her pent-up frustrations on the hapless wood. With a cry of rage and pent-up emotion, she delivered one last devastating, chakra-enhanced blow which shattered the log into hundreds of wooden slivers. Panting, the young blue-eyed Jinchuriki barely noticed her feline-containing counterpart as she approached, a somewhat somber expression on her face. As she spoke, her eyes carried a hint of pity. "Feel better now?" Akina let out a huff before she fell back onto the soft grass, Her form spread out as she breathed somewhat heavily from the exertion. Yujito watched her younger friend for a moment before she sat down at her side and took her injured, tender hand into her own. She spoke as she began to pull the slivers out. I know that this must be very frustrating for you, Akina. But you should have faith in Sensei. The younger girl pulled her hand away from the other girl's grasp as she sat up. This isn't fair, Yujito. We've trained so long and so hard for a chance to take him down, and now that we have the perfect chance to do that, it's like he's holding us back. Yojito embraced the younger girl in a comforting hug as she ran her hands through her hair. You know Sensei's never let us down before, he won't start now. Just have a little faith in him, Akina. Akina sighed in reluctant acceptance as she nodded. I guess you're right, Yugi. It'll be alright, Akina, soon, very soon. Yoshihiro silently walked along the first wall of the city, his men saluting or bowing in respect as he passed them by. He nodded or grunted in return. While others would fret over his age and health, he didn't really care. He enjoyed walking among his men, inspecting the defenses and overall readiness of them, something that others would call grunt's work. He enjoyed it immensely. It let him forget about the troubles of being a Kage for a few minutes, and it also brought back memories of glory and victory in his younger years during the first great Shinobi War. He had been only a genin at the time, but he had learned quickly, kinda had to in those days. Then again, when he was head of the Special Defense Squad during the Second Great War against Konoha, he had fought against the supposed god of shinobi, the professor and Sandaime Hokage, Sarutobi, and had won. Not to say he hadn't come out without a scratch, far from it actually, but he had nonetheless won and stopped Konoha from proceeding on to Iwa. Had it not been for Namikaze Minato, who had come to his Kage's rescue, he may have even succeeded in killing the old Sandaime. It was that victory that had bought enough time for their yondaime Tsuchikage, Nobunaga Oda, to arrive and turn the tides of the battle. They had then pushed Konoha back all the way to their own territory and even farther. After that was when Minato invented that technique, the Hiraishin, and had turned the tides yet again, eventually killing Nobunaga and forcing Iwa's surrender. It was those two victories, his victory against the Sandaime and Minato's victory against Nobunaga, that had gotten them both nominated, and eventually accepted as the Kages of their respective villages. He had met the boy during a Chunin exam again, about a month before the Kyuubi attack he had sacrificed himself to stop. He could honestly say the boy had impressed him, something not easily done outside of battle. The sheer force of character and charisma the young Kage practically exhumed spoke volumes of what he could have become. If Minato was still alive, Yoshihiro would most likely have done everything within his power to improve relations with Konoha and form an alliance. Despite the resistance he would undoubtedly be met with by his own ninja. Still, those dreams were in the past. Minato was dead and he was too tired to plow through the red tape, bureaucratic bullshit and politics to secure an alliance. If this world wanted to join him in hell, it was welcome too. He'd be heading there soon anyway. He held back a cough as he punched his chest to alleviate the sudden pain. Looking off to the side, his eyes caught the form of that Suna girl, Temari. She said her name was, if he recalled correctly. She stood on one of the many guard towers, her hair and black clothing fluttering in the harsh winds caused by the high tower. The light of the pale moon fell from the heavens, and for a moment she seemed to glow with this light, and Yoshihiro couldn't help but be impressed by her beauty. He knew that any of the youngsters who ended up with her would certainly be considered one lucky individual. Looking at her more closely, however, he found a tenseness on her, one he recognized easily. It was a mixture of fear, anxiety, excitement, and impatience. It happened to many who would be entering their first battle, but most of the men he had brought with him were seasoned veterans. They knew how to keep their heads cool when shit went to hell. This kind of attitude was that of a rookie chunin, not a jounin as her rank classified her. Unless, of course, she knows something. Not one that enjoyed being left out of the loop, the old Tsuchikage began making his way to the tower. Nodding to the guard that saluted as he approached, he went on through and up the stairs. Temari watched the city on the outside of the wall, or what was left of it. She felt somewhat bad for those who had their homes there, outside the city gates that is. Sakai had grown so much there was just no room within the walls, and so they had been forced to expand outside of them, seeing as how the ground behind it was too loose. Too unstable to make proper foundations for buildings, they had been forced to make them in front of the walls, where they were exposed to attacks by others, and any who weren't quick enough to get behind the wall before its massive 20-foot iron gates slammed shut would be left outside at the mercy of their enemies. A voice suddenly spoke up behind her, causing her to jump slightly. You know, any ninja with a good throwing arm and enough accuracy could take you out with ease, standing there so openly. As she spun around, her eyes came upon the form of one Yoshihiro Shimizu. Sighing somewhat in relief, and in order to rein in her temper at being snuck up on, she bowed. My apologies, Yoshihiro-sama, I was merely thinking. Cut the formalities, brat, I'm not in the mood and I can tell you're not either, he said as he sat down on one of the nearby benches. Temari's eyebrow twitched with mild irritation at the man's dismissal of her formality, something she rarely did, and whenever she did one had better appreciate it. Nevertheless, she straightened and looked back to the city. It's nothing really, she assured as she turned her back to the man. Come on now, girl, don't give me that crap, it's late and these old bones are tired, he said as he stood up and walked to her side. Temari sighed. While she wasn't particularly fond of discussing her problems with what was in essence a total stranger, she didn't want to also bear down her own friends, who had enough on their minds as it was. Besides, he had asked, so she supposed it was all right for him to listen. I had a dream or a nightmare, really. She leaned onto the stone as she sighed. I saw him standing over a battlefield. Dead were everywhere. The smell of blood was so thick. All of my friends, my brothers, even my sensei, were all dead at his feet, and I could see the Kazekage monument crumbling behind him as the village was lit on fire. The screams were horrible. Yeah, he sighed. The screams are always the worst, really. They stay in your head longer. Turning to look at her from the corner of his eye, he raised an eyebrow in silent question before he spoke. Still, this is interesting. I assume you're talking about this Hokage, Uzumaki Naruto. You never mentioned you'd met him before. Temari sighed. Once, about 10 years ago during the Suna Oto invasion attempt. Yeah, I heard about that. I assume you met him during the attack then? She shook her head. Met would not be the right word, I suppose. But yeah. She sighed as she turned and leaned her back against the stones. He certainly leaves an impression. Yoshihiro snorted with a smirk on his face. Right, I assumed the so-called Devil King would be impressive on the battlefield. The Devil King? She questioned with a slightly raised eyebrow. It's what some of the men started calling him after he beat Kusa-e Mentaki. The name just sort of stuck, I suppose. He shrugged. Temari nodded before she sighed and looked up to the stars. I hate dreams, she muttered, allowing Yoshihiro to smirk again. Life is nothing but a dream, kid, he then joined her as she gazed up to the stars. We just need to be bold and live it. Hinata, Lee, Tenten, Mika and Toshiro stood in one of the many tents of the camp. On the floor of this one was a map of the city they were to besiege. Because Shino was the commander, and was disabled, it fell to her to finalize the battle preparations, seeing as how she was the second in command. She sighed. While it was the first time she had led a battle on her own, she had seen Naruto, Guan, Kakashi and even Jiraiya enough times to know how to do it. Lee, Toshiro. She spoke firmly, catching the taijutsu master's and Kirin's attention as she used a stick to mark an area on the map. I want you two to take your men and focus your assault on the far northern part of the wall. It has received the most amount of structural damage due to our constant attacks from what the scouts report. You two are to push and batter that wall as hard as you possibly can. I want the enemy to start focusing their attention there by the time Tenten's unit and mine advance. Once you think you've drawn enough of the enemy's attention towards you, give a signal to us. My unit will then advance along to the main gate, drawing their attention again. By that time the forces along the southern end of the wall should be spread fairly thin. Mika, Tenten. She nodded to the other two women. You two are to push your attack there. Tenten, your unit is the best at long-range support. You are to gain the high ground of the defense towers, commandeer them one by one and then use them to help our men. Mika, your unit is the best at hit-and-run strike tactics. You are to be the ones to deliver the initial strike, and breach the wall into the city behind it. Use any tactics you want, just make sure you cripple the enemy in any way, either in morale, spirit or physically. The red-eyed Kunoichi smirked. Any tactics I want, eh? She asked, licking her lips as her eyes gleamed. Hinata's eyes narrowed. She had experienced firsthand how off the Kiri Kunoichi was. She hoped she was making the right choice. It was with great reluctance that she nodded. Lady Hyuga, if I may? Toshiro spoke from his place in the tent with a respectful bow as he extended his hand for the pointer stick Hinata held. She nodded as she handed it to him. The younger Kiri ninja then gestured to some areas within the city. His voice was deep but still held the hint of youth within it. I believe that, once we are inside of the city, there are 3 key locations which we should attempt to strike or altogether eliminate. He paused as he circled 3 areas of the city. From the intelligence received, these areas house the armory, the barracks, and one of the supply depots for this section of the city. If we strike at these 3 areas, it will no doubt weaken our enemy, both physically and mentally, should we fail in taking the city in this attack. Why should we destroy them? Once we've breached the wall, this section of the city is practically ours. We could use these facilities. Lee questioned as he thought over the proposal. Toshiro nodded in consent. I would agree, but thus far that Tsuchikage, Yoshihiro has proven himself to be a formidable enemy. If he pushes us back later, or even during this attack, his men will have to endure the less than favorable conditions if these facilities are destroyed. Our men already carry camping equipment, knowing that we would have to camp out during the long trip. Most of the IWA Nines may not have such equipment, believing they could rely on these facilities while they were defending the city. So then that would mean that the men that would subsequently be defending this section of the city, should they succeed in driving us back, would have to endure sleeping on floors, or cramped in small apartments. Damaged weapons wouldn't be able to be repaired as quickly if they had an armory right available to them. The same with supplies, having to take some from the next section of the city over, and so on, and so forth. Hinata nodded and was about to speak when the sound of clapping broke through the air. It drew their attention to the tent's entrance as the ever-imposing Guan and the copy ninja stepped through. Impressive, your strategic skills have grown, Hyuga-san, Toshiro. Kakashi-senpai. Lord Guan. Father, were the cries of mild surprise from the others. Kakashi gave him a smile as he waved. Hey, sorry we're late, we got lost on the road of life. Guan snorted, half in irritation, half in impatience. He looked at the younger ninja as he spoke. Very well, you 3 carry out your plan, Kakashi, and I will hang back so as not to get sucked into it. Our mission is to defeat Yoshihiro Shimizu. When someone has seen him and has definite confirmation, send another signal. We'll move in to deal with him so your units may continue with their mission. Is this understood? Hinata and the others nodded. Seeing everyone in agreement, Hinata spoke. Very well then, the attack will begin tomorrow morning. Chapter 44. Who will I be facing today? The morning sun was greeted by battle cries and explosions as it rose high above what was now another day in the city of Sakai. As instructed, Lee and Toshiro's unit had battered the northern wall with everything they had. Even so, IWA was holding on, forcing them to bleed for every inch of ground they gained. Lee's title as a taijutsu master truly shined through as his form was visible for a scant few seconds in which he was delivering vicious, and often brutal blows that shattered bones and snapped necks. His feet barely touched the ground for more than a brief second as he dodged and blocked kunai and shuriken with ease before appearing in front of the ninja and systematically disabling him. The gasps barely escaped their lips before they were almost instantly killed and or tossed into a world of blinding pain as their knees or their arms were broken in several places. Toshiro too showed his skills, but in a different way. Whereas Lee would dodge the attacks sent at him before he countered with his own, Toshiro simply shrugged them off. Whether they be kunai or shuriken, they simply bounced off the heavy armor that covered his form. Strangely, while it did seem heavy, the young Kiri ninja moved like it weighed nothing and could easily keep up with most of the IWA ninja that tried to attack him. He showed his mastery of the twin axes he carried with him as he hacked off limbs with single swings or crushed skulls with the dull side of them, the sickening cracks not even making the younger man wince before he moved on to his next victim. Together, the two distinct styles of combat kept the IWA ninja off balance as Lee and Toshiro continuously switched positions to confuse or surprise the enemy. From his temporary HQ, Yoshihiro watched as Konoha nuns began to push back the IWA nines along the northern side of the wall. He could tell this was not the main attack force, their numbers were too few and their aggressiveness too staged. Still, most of his men were beginning to get anxious. Having to watch your comrades get injured and killed was never easy, especially when you were just a little ways away. Yoshihiro-sama. One of his Jounin captains called to him. Please sir, they're getting slaughtered out there, let us go help them. The man pleaded, his features torn, as if he was struggling not to go over there himself. To hell with his permission. Yoshihiro sighed. While he admired the boy's bravery and loyalty to his comrades, he did not admire the boy's rashness. Still, he had to keep his men's morale high. Doing that meant keeping a delicate balance of complying with his men's wishes and doing what was tactically best. At this point he had to go with the former. If his men didn't think he cared about them, which he did, they would not fight for him, at least not as much as they would if they knew he cared for them. So for now, he would indulge them. All right. He sighed before looking at the Konoha ninja a ways behind him, each of them looking anxious and angry. Standing up, he made his way towards them. They froze for a moment before straightening up and bowing their heads in respect for their superior in both skill and rank. Yoshihiro looked each of them over before he finally spoke. All right, kids, you're under my control for now, so I want you three, he said, gesturing to Ino, Chuji, and Shikamaru, to head along to the northern wall with the reinforcement units. The three nodded before they left, sparing silent glances at their comrades as they left. As his men and temporary allies left, Yoshihiro allowed his eyes to travel over to the rest of the defensive structures. All right, brats, I'll play your game. As the axe in Toshiro's left hand split the skull of another IWA ninja, he spared a glance down to the courtyard where he saw that finally more ninja were coming to aid their comrades. Turning quickly, he deflected a kunai before throwing his axe in retaliation, catching the ninja in the chest with enough force to send him falling over the wall. Rushing over to the edge of the wall opposite the IWA means, he took out a green smoke bomb which he quickly tossed over the wall, the trail of green smoke rising high above them. Konoha Senpu! Was the cry he heard behind him. Spinning around, he caught sight of Lee as the taijutsu master delivered a brutal spin kick to another ninja's face, snapping his neck and sending him crashing into his comrades, knocking a few of them off the wall. Catching sight of another ninja getting ready to throw either a kunai or shuriken at Lee, he threw his other axe, catching the man in the temple with a sickening crunch. Blood and brain matter splattering the floor beneath him in a gruesome display. Lee continued to pound away at his opponents, easily taking them down. He gave pause, however, as he caught sight of a small black tendril approaching him from the ground. Curious, but not curious enough to let it approach him, the taijutsu master leapt back. To his surprise, however, the black tendril continued to follow his form, or his shadow. Recalling what Guy had said at one point about Konoha's clans, he recalled Naruto's ability. He also recalled some of the reports from the scouts that IWA Nines had been seen using Konoha techniques against them. Thinking fast, Lee grabbed a flash bomb from his pouch. Revealing light. He called out the code word to warn all nearby allies of what he was about to use. Then he threw it towards the enemy ranks, as far away from his men as possible. A massive flash and deafening noise tore through the air around them. Lee's ears were ringing and he could scarcely see the faint outlines of people in the distance. This was why these were not used more often. They were very disorienting, and sometimes even those with warning could end up blinded or deaf for minutes at a time, and for a ninja that was deadly. Still, the taijutsu user had enough sense to look back at the receding shadow and follow it to the user who stood a few feet away, clutching his bleeding ears as tears leaked from his eyes. Though he felt as if the bones in his legs were toothpicks, Lee still made his way over to the shadow user and delivered a brutal kick to the downed man's ribs. He would have continued his assault had it not been for the massive fist that smashed into his side at the moment, nearly sending him over the wall had it not been for his reflex to grab the ledge. Chuji, though, too, was feeling the crippling effects of the flash bomb, but he luckily had managed to open his eyes long enough to catch sight of the ninja that had attacked his best friend and lashed out in retaliation. He felt his fist hit something and hoped it was the attacking ninja. Opening his eyes again, he could faintly see the ninja trying to lift himself up from the ledge of the wall. Not wanting to give the man a chance to do so, the large ninja picked himself up and made his way over in order to kick him off or something. Before he was halfway there, however, something crashed into his back, sending both him and whoever had crashed into him over the wall. Passing right by Lee, the taijutsu user could only stare in mild confusion as two blurry figures flashed past him and fell to the floor below. Picking himself up, he managed to catch sight of the shadow wielder again as he stood, being helped up by a blonde-haired kunoichi. Judging from her appearance, she was far enough away from the flashbang to have not been affected too severely. Taking a moment to regain his bearings, Lee finally managed to get the ringing out of his ears and clear the blurriness from his vision. He shook his head and saw that the shadow-using ninja had apparently regained his bearings, and now both he and the blonde-haired girl were taking up their stances to fight him. Remembering what he had heard, the shadow techniques went with the Yamanaka's mind techniques and the Akimichi's body-enlarging strength techniques. So judging by their looks, the girl was a Yamanaka and the one that had hit him was an Akimichi. All of these techniques were relatively slow, so if he could just keep himself moving fast, he would hopefully be able to eliminate them. Well, it was worth a shot. Lee took his stance and with a blur of movement was already upon them. Meanwhile, down below, Toshiro, who had tackled Shuji when he saw him approaching Lee, could only groan in pain as he picked himself off the floor. He was not affected that badly by the flashbang since he had been far away, but if the flashbang didn't cripple his senses, the fall had certainly crippled him. That was a 70-foot drop, and even with ninja training that was a leap. Landing on his feet wouldn't have been so bad, but he hadn't landed on his feet. Luckily, he was able to use chakra on his armor to absorb the blow. But it still hurt. Picking himself up, he stole a glance at the large man he had tackled, only to find him in a similar situation of getting to his feet. Luckily, some of his Kiri ninja had seen him fall and had pushed their way past many of the still stunned IWA Nins in order to make it to him, spreading the fight down the wall into the courtyard. Straightening up, he stood to his full height of 5'10" and turned to face the ninja he had tackled, only to find himself staring up at Chuji's imposing height of 6'1", 6 feet 3 inches with the extra bulk of his body armor. Toshiro had the good sense to keep his sudden trepidation from his face. Okay then. The ninja along the central wall, distracted by the battle taking place so close by, never noticed the extra force of Konoha ninja as they crept silently up the wall, hidden by a masked genjutsu. Hinata's Byakugan flared to life, sending out a pulse of chakra, dispersing her part of the, shortly after others holding the genjutsu dropped theirs before the ninja leapt over the wall with a battle cry, catching the unsuspecting ninja by surprise as they cut them down without mercy. Blood splattered the cold, stone floor at their feet as throats and arteries were slashed. Kunai rained down from the guard towers, killing more Konoha ninja as the thrown projectiles were tossed with pinpoint accuracy. Hinata, however, continued to push forward. She showed just why she was the Hyuga clan head. She would continually switch between juken strikes, catching weapons aimed at her and using them to catch her opponent by surprise, easily twisting and contorting her body expertly to avoid both incoming projectiles and physical strikes from the opponents in front of her before countering with her own quick, devastating attacks. The chakra in her palm was like a piercing, thin knife, injuring the heart, kidneys, lungs, and other important vital organs with nothing but light taps as she seemed to flow like water between her attackers. Yoshihiro smirked as he could faintly see the silhouette of the Hyuga girl he had fought before, above the central wall. Well, she was certainly skilled, even though she was too much of a rookie to really go against him one-on-one. Give her a few more years still. If he didn't do something now, then it looked like she really would break through the central group with relative ease, something he couldn't allow. Looking around, he decided that he didn't want to really send out another unit from the reserves, seeing as how he only had one left since he had sent out 2 to the northern wall. Alright then. He contemplated before he looked back at the Suna ninja. Okay, dog boy, Pinky and Blondie, he said, making Kiba, Sakura, and Temari bristle in anger, though they kept their tongues to themselves as they approached. Alright, brats, he peered into the distance, pointing at the white-clad form of Hinata. You see that girl over there? Aren't you a bit old for her? Kiba shot back only to get an elbow to the gut, which knocked the air knocked out of his lungs as Akamaru growled his disapproval of his master's impertinence, though he could faintly hear Kiba chuckling at having gotten one over the old man. Yoshihiro rolled his eyes as he pointed again. She's the enemy commander. Take her out and the enemy morale will collapse and they'll be easily pushed back. That's your job. 3 of us against 1 woman? Isn't that a little much? Temari questioned, somewhat insulted at the insinuation that she was weak. Yeah, well, I fought her before, she's tough. And this time she'll be at the top of her game, for sure. And also, since I don't know your skills that well, a little overkill won't be so bad. Add to that, she's a Hyuga. Eh? Sakura questioned, memories of their old classmate Hinata suddenly returning to her. She had never been close to the girl, but intelligence reports from the investigators shortly after the massacre 9 years ago reported that it was Hinata that had been the one to betray them to the one that had ultimately killed off everyone at the compound. Needless to say, she was held in no high regard amongst their groups since then. Kiba was immediately serious as he straightened. Do you know her name? Was it by any chance Hinata or something like that? Yoshihiro paused as he watched the dog boy and the dog girl tense up as their canine companions growled in anger. He knew her name, since his scouts had reported it. But judging by their body language, they would be completely irrational with anger if he said that was her name. So deciding to play it smart, he simply said, I don't know. It was surprisingly difficult to get spies within the camp to gather intelligence. Kiba growled before he rushed off. Kiba! Temari yelled after him only to curse as she whipped out her fan and took to the air, Sakura soon leaping up to join her. That brother of yours is a real hothead, isn't he? The Tsuchikage spoke back to Hana with a lazy shrug. Hana, though also angry, had to agree with the Tsuchikage. Her brother really needed to learn how to control his temper. One of these days it was going to get him into trouble. Kaiten! Hinata yelled. A massive shock wave of chakra soon enveloped the part of the wall she had been standing on, sending nearly a dozen Iwan and flying as the Kaiten blew them away. With the Byakugan still activated, she caught sight of two unique sights approaching her fast. A man riding a massive dog and two girls riding a large fan. For a moment she didn't register them in her mind, but then she recognized their features: Inuzuka clan markings and a white/beige dog. An Inuzuka? Here? Well, now this just got interesting. She thought before she reached into her robes and pulled out a red smoke bomb. Throwing it over the wall, she then turned back to the approaching ninja, who seemed quite fixated on her if the direction of their eyes was anything to go by. Yoshihiro continued to overlook the ongoing battle from his temporary HQ when his senses caught something. Smirking, he looked to the last of his commanders. Take your men to the wall, Inuzuka girl, south mind you. That's probably where the next wave is coming from. Hana looked at the older man a little strangely and was about to protest when an explosion rocked the southern wall, indicating that indeed the next attack was coming from there. She rushed off, her three dogs following shortly after her. As soon as everyone left, Yoshihiro allowed the smirk on his features to widen. Well, you two must indeed be skilled, considering you were able to get in here without anyone noticing. The two guards who stood at the entrance of the room behind him were suddenly enveloped in a puff of smoke, revealing the copy ninja Kakashi and the former member of the Seven Swordsmen, Guan. Taking out 6 kunai, Kakashi threw them to the 4 corners of the room, and the center of the floor and ceiling. They glowed purple for a brief moment before a purple barrier was suddenly erected around the room. It was similar to the Sound Force technique, only difference was that this had a time limit of about 20 minutes, and if one of the kunai were destroyed, the whole barrier would fall apart. Still, hopefully 20 minutes would be enough to deal with Yoshihiro, or at least weaken him between the two of them. Well, now Yoshihiro spoke as he stood from his seat and turned around. My name is Yoshihiro Shimazu, otherwise known as Devil Shimazu. Who will I be facing today? The older man questioned with a grin as he hefted his hammer onto his shoulder, smirking at them. Looks like the brat had decided to send some, not so wet behind the ears to face him this time. Copy ninja, Sharingan no Kakashi. Second in command of the Seven Swordsmen, Green Dragon of Kiriguan. Yoshihiro's smirk only widened. This was a fight he was definitely going to enjoy. Who knows, maybe this time he'd have to actually use his clan's signature technique. Meanwhile, somewhere within Lightning Country, 2 men wearing cloaks with red clouds were sitting around the campfire. One had bleached blonde, almost silvery hair with a 3-bladed scythe on his back. The other was rather tall, standing at 6 feet 8 inches with a cowl covering his lower features as well as a headpiece which covered the rest of his head, leaving only his eyes visible, which were somewhat beady and white around the iris. Geez, how long is this gonna take? We've been skirting around this place for nearly the past month. This is getting real fucking annoying. I say we should just go in now and fucking. Quiet, his partner snapped. We'll make our move when pain commands us, no sooner, no later. The silver-haired man snarled in anger but kept his silence. Hopefully the leader would contact them soon. If not, well, let's just say it wouldn't be pretty. Chapter 45, The Siege of Sakai. The air left Shikamaru's stomach as a kick slammed against him, which was followed shortly by another to his face, sending him smashing against the cold stone of the wall. What did that guy have for bones? Rock? Nah, that wasn't nearly hard enough. Steel, maybe? Shikamaru! He heard Ino yell out to him. Looking back to her, he saw their opponent appear behind her, a fist already formed and headed for her face. She managed to sense him at the last second, ducking under the punch and spinning around with a kunai in her hand as she took a swipe at him. Lee, however, was far faster, both physically and in his reflexes. Lifting his left foot up, he slammed it against her forearm, causing her to drop the blade with a sharp pain. The taijutsu user then leapt up and delivered a spin kick across her face with his right leg, making her roll with the sheer force of the kick. Shikamaru pushed down the urge to go to Ino as she recovered from the brutal-looking kick and formed his shadow again, extending the tendril, hoping to catch the taijutsu specialist by surprise. As the black sliver approached, however, Lee, and subsequently his shadow vanished from Shikamaru's line of sight. He felt a minor wind blow against his cheek, which was the only warning he received before a fist decked him right across the jaw, sending him rolling towards Ino, landing at her side in a heap. "Shikamaru," she growled out. "This isn't really going well." "No shit," he shot back as he picked himself up and rubbed his now bruising jaw. He opened and closed his mouth a couple of times as he looked back to Lee, who stood in his fighting stance, the white clothing a stark contrast to the dull gray, light green and black of the ninja around them. The cogs in Shikamaru's mind slowly turned as he began to come up with a plan. Finally, after a few seconds, his mind came up with something. "Ino," he spoke, not taking his eyes off of Lee. "I may have a way to beat him, just follow my lead." Ino nodded, knowing better than to argue with Shikamaru. He was smarter than her after all, she begrudgingly admitted. So it was quite a surprise when, instead of trying to attack what was obviously a taijutsu master from a distance, he instead rushed him, apparently intent on fighting him on his own terms. "Wait a minute, Shikamaru!" she yelled after him before she followed. Toshiro screamed as he was bodily thrown a good 20 feet by his opponent, smashing the nearby stone bench he was thrown onto as he landed. "Oh," he groaned as he slowly rolled over to push himself up. Getting to his knees, he spared a glance at the giant of a man now making his way towards him. The young Kirinin took a deep breath before he lifted himself completely. His axes were on the floor, behind Chuji. They had fallen out of his grip when he was thrown. He had to get them back, seeing as how much of his fighting style and complemental jutsu revolved around those axes, each imbued with special seals to allow them to absorb and channel chakra better than normal blades, thus facilitating the process. If he didn't get those back, well, he might as well be fighting with one hand behind his back. As Chuji approached, Toshiro settled himself in his fighting stance. Ducking under Chuji's fist, he tried to counter with an upwards punch into the man's stomach, only for the loud ringing sound of metal to reach his ears as his fist met the armor under Chuji's clothes. Biting back another painful grunt, he tried to punch Chuji in the face, only for Chuji to catch his fist in one hand and deliver his own punch with the other. Toshiro tried to block, but with Chuji's super strength it didn't do much good, and he was still smashed against the side of a nearby building. His vision swam, and for a moment he couldn't really remember where he was or how he got there. But soon the disorientation passed, and he managed to recall everything. So it was no surprise that the moment he noticed Chuji was near his fallen form, he lashed out, moving to kick his feet out from under him, only for his shin to meet with even more metal plating and an unyielding hunk of flesh. Grabbing him by his face, Chuji lifted Toshiro up with a single arm and began repeatedly slamming him against the building until the wall itself collapsed. When he released the Kiri ninja, and he simply crumpled to the ground, Chuji was only mildly surprised to see him collapse into a water puddle. As his ears picked up footsteps behind him, he spun around in time to block Toshiro's two axes with his armored forearm. Toshiro smirked, and a water dragon, of relatively small size, exploded from the building behind Chuji, being formed from the water in the building's plumbing. Chuji snapped his attention back, but wasn't fast enough to move out of the way as the water dragon crashed over him. Strangely, though, it caused no pain, and barely even budged him from his spot. Chuji was about to disregard this as simply his opponent being weak when he noticed two things. 1. The water wasn't dripping off of him as it normally should, it was actually much slower, a scant few drops every 5 to 10 seconds, and when one is thoroughly soaked, that is very odd. And the second thing he noticed was Toshiro's smirk. Soon the reason why he was smirking became apparent as lightning began to form over his axes. Chuji's eyes widened and he kicked the Kiri ninja off him before he leapt back to a relatively safe distance. Soon, however, Toshiro was on him again, his axes arching through the air as he swung, lightning trailing behind it. Chuji tried to dodge, not being nearly stupid enough to try and block, as wet as he was, but the lightning still jumped to him, making excruciating pain shoot through his whole system. He staggered for a moment, but had enough sense to block a follow-up swing to his head, though he was rewarded only with another painful jolt coursed through his system, followed by a kick to his stomach which sent him flying back, not being prepared to absorb the blow as he normally would. Toshiro smirked. His two elemental affinities were for water and wind. Any ninja with any of these two specific elemental affinities was considered a rarity. His adopted father, Guan, had been the one to discover his two affinities during one of their training sessions together. When it had happened, Toshiro didn't really know what to expect from his father, but he soon realized he didn't need to really worry. The look of veiled pride in the man's eyes was all he really needed. And shortly after he had brought some scrolls on manipulating both lightning and water elemental chakra. He had only recently passed his exam, and this was really his first actual battle, but he was determined to make both his village, as well as his father, proud. He refused to openly lose to anyone short of the Tsuchikage himself on this battlefield. Chuji stood back up and ignored the involuntary twitches throughout most of his extremities as he stood up and glared at Toshiro. Looking at himself, he confirmed that he was still quite wet. Looking back to Toshiro, and the lightning crackling over his twin axes, he knew that he would be in for a tough fight. Kaiten! Hinata yelled again, scattering the IWA Nins atop the wall, and sending them smashing against their comrades as the sheer force behind the spinning barrier threw them off like rag dolls. Coming to a halt, her Byakugan caught sight of two distinct blurs shooting towards her, before they were anywhere near her, twisting and contorting her body in a way that allowed both of the shadowy blurs to pass her by harmlessly. As they each came to a halt, she found two identical-looking boys standing behind her, though it didn't take long for her to realize that one was under a henge. It also didn't take her long to recognize the clan markings as those of the Inuzuka clan. The boy sniffed the air and snarled, I knew it was you." Hinata paused as she took in the young man's features, her features twisted into something akin to recognition mixed with disbelief. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Kiba?" She questioned somewhat uncertainly, unwilling to believe that this was her old classmate. Just what on earth were the chances of that? The Inuzuka snarled again, his fangs lengthening even more than what was normal for an Inuzuka before he lunged at her, Akamaru not being too far behind. Hinata snapped out of her disbelieving stupor in an instant, catching Kiba's wrist as he tried an upward slash and using her free hand to strike at several pressure points along his chest. The Inuzuka male coughed up blood before he tried to swipe at her extended hand with his free one. Hinata was far faster than him, however, and simply moved back away before she delivered a straight kick to his stomach. Her legs still extended, she leapt over Akamaru as the dog attempted another Tsuga attack. She settled herself into the starting stance of the hack, ready to strike at the animal's exposed back when another attack above her caught her attention. Back flipping 3 times, she settled herself on the edge of the wall as several wind blades cut down into the area she'd been standing on, followed shortly by 2 kunoichi. One she recognized easily enough. If Kiba was any indication, that would be Sakura. The other she vaguely recognized, not from her class though. If she had to guess, she was most likely from another genin team from Konoha that was around before she graduated. That would explain the vague feeling of familiarity. Still, where she recognized these people from wasn't important. What was important was that she was now facing 3 opponents. 4 if you counted the dog. The Inuzuka was too headstrong and brash, and his partner, no matter how intelligent it was still an animal. It would act only in the most basic of ways and would follow attacks that would fall into a predictable pattern after the first few strikes. But now she had 2 more kunoichi. As the girl she recognized as Sakura form a chakra scalpel in her hand, it made it abundantly clear that she was a medic nin, while the other was a long-range wind specialist, judging by the fan in her hand. Sakura began to slowly make her way to Kiba, one hand still with the bluish fire of the chakra scalpel, the other glowing green with healing chakra. Hinata narrowed her eyes. The injury she had given Kiba was a somewhat debilitating one, but also relatively easy to heal. If Sakura healed it, then that advantage was blown out the window. But she couldn't get to her without exposing herself to considerable injury from the other girl and Kiba's dog. Before Sakura made it to the Inuzuka boy, however, a voice made her pause. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you to do that." A swarm of Kikechus suddenly condensed and made a shape between the two. Before Sakura could pull back, a blade was held against her throat, same with Kiba. The swarm took on more color, revealing none other than Shino. "Shino!" Hinata cried out in surprise. "But you're—" "The colony will always repair the hive, Hinata-san," he interrupted respectfully and simply, answering her unasked question. Temari didn't take her eyes off Hinata as she settled herself between the Hyuga head and the Abirame head. Akamaru growled and snarled as he stood behind the boy, but did not dare to make a move while his master was in danger. Kiba snarled at the man, his teeth gnashing together as he did. You damn bastard, you sold us out to that monster, you traitor." Shino looked Inuzuka right in the eyes as he spoke. "If I recall correctly, Inuzuka-san, my father was still the clan head at the time. I had nothing to do with his decision. And if it were up to me, I never declared any vow of loyalty to you, so I have betrayed no one. Kiba's fangs lengthened before he barked out his command. Akamaru. The dog lunged at the Abirame, only for said ninja to burst into insects and stick to the dog's fur like ticks as they began to eat its chakra. Soon its henge dispelled, revealing the dog as it clawed and bit at the insects sticking to his fur. Kiba and Sakura used the opportunity to leap away from the bug user as he reformed himself. As Shino reformed, he let his eyes travel to Hinata. Silently he looked to Kiba, and then to Akamaru before looking back at her. She got the message, those two were his. She would deal with Sakura and Temari. Tenten and Mika worked their way up the third tower. They had already taken the first two, rather easily in the initial attack. The third, however, was giving them some trouble, now that the men were prepared to, and rather desperate to repel them. If they took all 7 towers, they would put the entire southwestern section of the city under their thumb. Tenten's unit was known for their long-range skills, both with kunai and the weapon mistress had requested this unit. It was almost completely experimental, and this would be their first trial by fire mission. As the two dispatched the ninja, atop the third tower, they spared a glance at the battlefield below. The fight along the northern end had spread out to the courtyard, but along the central part of the wall the men on the wall itself were only beginning to give ground. The red-eyed, silver-haired Kiri ninja looked to the next tower before she looked back to Tenten. Let's keep MO. Look out! The cry reached their ears and the two girls snapped their attention over to the side, only to find a massive shredding tornado approaching them. The two kunoichi rushed and leapt off the edge as the spinning form decimated the tower they had previously been standing on. Rolling with their fall, the two spun around. Weapons on hand, they found one massive wolf-like dog standing atop it, along with 8 other horse-sized similar-looking dogs standing over the rubble around it. A single woman sat atop the largest one, over his shoulders as she gripped its fur like the reins of a horse. Alrighty boys, she growled, as her fangs lengthened. Feeding time. Each of the massive beasts snarled, growled and roared, drool sliding down the edges of their mouth as they looked positively feral, letting out a howl. 4 of them rushed the 2 girls while 4 more went after other random ninja. Tenten unrolled the scroll, removing a double-pointed spear staff. Grabbing it, she managed to place it between one of the dog's jaws as it tried to bite at her throat. Grunting with some effort, she threw the creature off her and jabbed one end of her spear staff into its side. The animal howled in pain as it reared back on its hind legs and tried to bite down on the offending weapon, but it couldn't reach. Tenten smirked, but soon the second dog helped his comrade, its jaws biting down on the wooden oak staff with enough force to snap it like a twig in a single bite. Tenten leapt back as the creature then tried to swipe at her with its claws. Unrolling another scroll, she took out 2 short, double-bladed sabers. She rushed the 2 animals, her weapons ready to cleave the flesh from their bones. The 2 creatures tried to bite her, but she avoided both of them easily enough before she slashed at them, trailing the blade from their front shoulder, all the way to their hind leg. The 2 dogs let out another howl of pain before they both vanished into clouds of smoke. Mika openly laughed as the 2 animals chased her around. Their snarls and growls were music to her ears, the blood pumping through her veins as adrenaline fueled her. She lived for this, the thrill of battle, the thrill of the chase, the hunt, the baiting. But most of all, she slashed at the creature's throat, slicing it wide open, allowing its life essence to pour over her. She loved the thrill of blood, the essence of all life. She loved to watch the shock, the disbelief in their eyes as they went all empty. It was almost orgasmic to her. Her silver hair was now matted down to her forehead, red with blood, her eyes shining with malice and barely restrained sanity as she looked to the second creature, watching how it cringed at the sight of her. Reveling in the instinctual fear she could feel coming from it, taking it all in. Her smile was slow and deliberate, her eyes opening to take in the beast's form before she vanished from its sight. The creature barely had time to move before the sword was plunged into the back of its head. Mika removed the blade with a sickening slice as she lapped up the blood with sickening glee, ignoring the beast as it vanished in a cloud of smoke. Hannah watched as the 2 girls finished off her summons. While those summons were not incredibly strong, the fact that they were able to do it so quickly was a testament to their skill. Tapping her mount on the side twice with her leg, the creature adjusted its position to look down on the 2 Konoha kunoichi. Alright then girls, looks like I'm gonna have to deal with you myself. She spoke smirking as the 2 took their fighting stances. It had been a long time, hopefully her place on the council hadn't gotten her too rusty. Haha. Come on, is that all that you two legends got? Yoshihiro spoke mockingly as he blocked one of Guan's strikes, though it was with some visible effort. The older man pushed the swordsman off of him before he rolled to the side to avoid Kakashi's kunai slash. Guan recovered quickly and rushed at Tsuchikage again. Yoshihiro got to his knees and flung the massive war hammer he wielded like a simple hand axe towards the swordsman. Guan, caught off guard by the unexpected movement, instinctively tried to bat the massive weapon aside, but the success was merely a partial one. The weapon had managed to knock him onto his back by sheer size and weight. Yoshihiro then got to his feet, looking at Kakashi as the man completed his hand seals. Katon Karyu! The Sharingan wielder cried out before he blew out a massive fire dragon towards the Tsuchikage. Doton, Hari no Tate. Yoshihiro spoke calmly, forming his own hand seals, before earth began forming around his arm in a rough circle. Hiding behind it, the sheer heat of the flames licked his skin but did no damage. When the attack died down, he had a scant warning before Kakashi smashed through his shield, with a chakra-enforced kick, connecting with the older man's chest, sending him rolling backwards from the impact. Yoshihiro got to his feet and began blocking a rapid series of more punches and kicks from his opponent. Kakashi was faster than him for certain, but Yoshihiro was much more physically built than he was and was able to absorb most of the blows that got through with minimal effort. Yoshihiro was also patient, knowing that a little pain now for you can sometimes mean a lot more pain for your opponent later. Kakashi would soon get overconfident, thinking that because he hadn't tried to counterattack once that he simply couldn't, and that would lead to a more sloppy defense. Add to that the legendary copy ninja hadn't even had the decency to remove his eye patch. While Yoshihiro felt somewhat obligated to show that even though he was old he could still keep up with the young guns pretty damn well. Finally he found a single glaring opening in the Sharingan wielder's attacks, and before Kakashi could react delivered a powerful punch right to the man's solar plexus. Kakashi gasped as the air forcefully left his lungs. Still, Yoshihiro had to give the man some credit. That hit would have anyone else coughing up blood with the air. Kakashi had seen the counter at the last minute and managed to shift his body a bit better to absorb the blow with more ease. Coughing and gasping for air, Kakashi barely managed to raise his arm to block an elbow to his face, though it didn't do him much good as Yoshihiro's sheer size and weight broke through his guard and smashed against his face anyway. Yoshihiro didn't have a moment to spare, however, as he looked back to Guan, who had recovered from his throw and was now ready to slash at him with that cleaver he called a sword. Looking back to his hammer, he extended 2 chakra strings and latched onto it before yanking it towards him. Guan sensed a movement behind him and rolled forward in time to avoid the hammer which flew over his head. He didn't pause in his run, however, and continued undeterred. Dragging his blade behind him, he swung in an upwards motion, only for the sound of metal against metal to reach their ears as Yoshihiro blocked the strike, shifting it so it passed over his head before he took a swing at Guan's legs. The swordsman leapt over it, coming back with another downward strike, using the added force of his jump. Yoshihiro stepped to the side, watching as the blade cracked and snapped the floorboards with its sheer weight. Guan tried to swing at his face, only for the Tsuchikage to simply lean back and block the next swing with his hammer. The sound of 1,000 birds reached their ears. Yoshihiro snapped his head back to look at Kakashi as the man rushed him, lightning trailing behind his hand, leaving a deep, jagged trench as he moved. The Sharingan, now exposed, spinning wildly. The Tsuchikage moved with speed the 2 Jounins didn't think him capable of, pushing Guan straight into Kakashi's path and letting the lightning pierce his chest instead. Water, not blood, sprayed from the wound before Guan collapsed into a puddle. Yoshihiro wasted no time and smashed his hammer over Kakashi's skull, only for his opponent to vanish in a cloud of smoke. The 2 in question suddenly appeared from below and above him, Kakashi exploding from the ground below / behind him while Guan appeared above him. Kakashi drove a kunai into his spine, and Guan sliced off his head, which promptly was replaced with a wooden floorboard. Well, now the 2 looked to a slightly panting Yoshihiro as he leaned against his hammer along the other end of the room. "You 2 aren't half bad," he complimented me. The 2 straightened and looked to the Tsuchikage. "Well, as you said, we are legends," Kakashi accented as he took out 2 more kunai. "Indeed." Guan spoke up next. "Today, Yoshihiro Shimazu, is the day you end." The Tsuchikage chuckled softly at that. "Yeah, you 2 kids are strong. You definitely have a good chance of beating me, even with my special techniques. Let's see if I'm right, shall we?" he questioned, smirking. Kakashi and Guan tensed as something that looked like steam began hissing up from the man's skin, and it turned a deep reddish color, as if he'd gotten a bad sunburn, and his eyes dilated slightly, becoming unfocused before they came back into focus, glowing an eerie green color, similar to his natural eye color. It's been a long time since I've had to use this technique. Let's see if you can figure out how to break out of it before I smash your skulls in. The two Jounins tensed as Shimizu's chakra flared. Chapter 46, The Siege of Sakai, Part 2. As Yoshihiro's chakra flared, Kakashi and Guan didn't know what had actually happened, but the next thing they both knew, this indescribable pressure, a seething raw fear gripped them. They struggled to breathe as cold sweat trickled down their foreheads. Kakashi felt his legs go weak, and he actually had to kneel to avoid falling on his ass. His vision swam for a moment, and if it wasn't for his Sharingan, he wasn't sure if he would have recovered as quickly. Guan himself was leaning heavily against his sword in order to keep himself upright. The two stared back at Yoshihiro, whose red skin and eerie glowing eyes increased the crushing feeling around them. The steam coming off the older man made it seem like he was being cooked, but that taunting, smug smirk of his still remained firmly plastered on his face. "This, kids," he chuckled, "is my special technique. You like it?" he questioned mockingly. Kakashi's Sharingan eye slowly started to spin, as he realized this was some kind of genjutsu, but to his shock and no small amount of increasing horror, he couldn't dispel it. Yoshihiro saw Kakashi's distress and laughed openly at the copy ninja. "Don't even try that Sharingan of yours, Hitaki. It's impossible to break out of this thing with cheap tricks." "But how? That shouldn't be possible," Kakashi gasped out, struggling to push down his fear enough to get to his feet. Yoshihiro gave what sounded like a cross between a snort and a chuckle as he shook his head. "You kids, always trying to go over the top. If it's not a newer, flashier technique, it's a fancy eye technique that blows up a city block, never sticking to the basics." The older man sighed and shook his head. "Come on now, you're two, what do you know that has similar effects as this genjutsu?" Guan thought for a moment before he looked at Yoshihiro, his eyes widening in disbelief. "No, that's not possible. No one has this much killing intent, not even Naruto-sama." Yoshihiro smirked. Judging by the sound of your voice, you must certainly hold that Naruto kid in pretty high regard, either that or you fear him plenty. Anyway, yes kiddo, you are right. This is killing intent." "That's not possible," Kakashi rasped out, as he mentally counted off the several techniques for shrugging off killing intent that he knew. So far, they had managed to get his legs to regain some of their strength, but not much else. Yoshihiro's smirk still remained firmly planted over his lips. "The fact that you're struggling to breathe says differently, copycat." Kakashi glared at him, but Yoshihiro ignored it before he looked to Guan and then back to Kakashi. "No matter what you believe, this is killing intent, just a lot more refined than what you're normally used to." He chuckled. "You see, the Shimizu clan, my clan, were the very first to discover the subtle projection which is known as killing intent. This was during the very early age of ninja and ninjutsu itself, so we tried to keep the technique a secret, thinking that we'd come up with something truly grand. Then when blood limits and ninja clans began to be formed in the villages, with various manipulations and selective breeding, we of the Shimizu tried to become a clan. The village at the time could only support one clan though, so our rivals, the clay wielders of IWA, moved to steal our secrets, and we tried to steal theirs. In the end, they got to our secrets first, and spread them. Showed our abilities to the members of their clans, so now they had both their clan techniques, as well as our own, so they managed to secure their place as the main IWA clan. Eventually, killing intent, as it is now known, is far and wide spread to all other countries, not being guarded very well by the clay wielders. And so our clan faded into the background. But many of our clan members still sought to secure their place as a clan, so many of our clan heads and their heirs continually tried to refine and expand killing intent, because we were the ones that discovered it. We knew some more specifics on how it formed and how it affects the targets. So we were able to refine it further, making the effects of our killing intent up to 10 times as potent as it normally would be, eventually creating a minor genjutsu to enhance it even further. Kakashi's eyes narrowed and he was about to say something when Yoshihiro turned to him and spoke. "The reason your eye doesn't even detect that is because we already found a way to cancel out that little effect of your Sharingan. We lost many of our clan members to those eyes in the war, and so I dedicated much of my spare time to further refining our technique, eventually creating a ninjutsu to go along with it. This technique is, in essence, a ninjutsu, Genjutsu hybrid, hence the change in my skin color, that's the ninjutsu at work, and my eyes, that's the. This time, his smirk was laced with a palpable gloat. Something that is completely unique. Your Sharingan is used to dispelling genjutsu and copying ninjutsu. But here it can do neither. When it tries to cancel the genjutsu portion of this technique, it becomes confused, because it's also trying to detect and copy the ninjutsu. But it can't do that either, because of the genjutsu over that. Kakashi's features tightened. The effects of killing intent could be shrugged off, or ignored entirely, but at this intensity it was almost suffocating. Also, the fact that it had been so long since killing intent had affected him for any long amount of time was something that had to be taken into account. Yoshihiro watched as the two jounin took their fighting stances as best they could beneath the crushing force of their own fear and smirked. He had also actually lied about one part of that story. He hadn't created this technique so early in his life. He had actually refined and perfected it to this degree, about 9 years ago, when the Naruto kid had taken Taki, Aim, and Kusa. He realized that his people still needed him, and still relied on him as their protector. He supposed he was partly to blame. He put up a very strong front, and used old tricks and experience to keep any upstart in line with seemingly minimal effort. But the truth of the matter was, that he knew he was getting on in his years, whereas about 15 to 20 years ago he could have probably taken on any of the in their prime with a solid chance of victory. Nowadays, he wasn't even sure if he could beat two jounin. He was getting slower, his bones becoming more fragile, his joints losing cartilage, making it painful to move around too much, muscles losing their strength, reflexes dulling, and other minor illnesses that were beginning to take their toll. For a close-range fighter like him, age was the worst enemy he could possibly face. When this Naruto kid had come along, he knew that he would never be able to beat the kid in an up-close one-on-one match. So he had visited his old clan chiefs, finding his predecessors' research and scroll techniques, and in the end had come up with this technique in the hopes that he'd be able to use it against Naruto to get some kind of edge over the brat. That way, even if he lost the fight, and he probably would, he'd injure the brat enough for someone else to take him down. Yoshihiro felt pressure building in his chest before he muffled some coughs with his fist. Using the opportunity, Kakashi and Guan rushed at Tsuchikage, the minor hesitancy in their steps practically screaming to Yoshihiro of their intentions before they were ever even close to him. Looks like he may win this one after all. Lee blocked a spin kick from Shikamaru as well as a drop kick from Ino before he pushed them both off. Before Ino even landed, however, another kick connected with her stomach, nearly sending her over the edge of the wall had she not managed to grab onto the ledge. Shikamaru had a spare second to see Lee vanish from where he had kicked Ino, in order to drop to the floor to avoid a spin kick that would have slammed into the back of his head. Moving to kick Lee's feet out from under him, he was not surprised when his attack didn't even make Lee stumble. It was only a second or so later a kick connected with his stomach, sending him tumbling until he reached the stairs, nearly falling down them in the process. Lee was about to continue his attack when he realized that he couldn't move. Shikamaru slowly stood up, Lee imitating his movements. The shadow user smirked and looked at Lee, confident that he now had the taijutsu master under his thumb. He had connected his shadow during the taijutsu exchange. It had been tough to concentrate with Lee's powerful attacks pummeling him, and even tougher to keep up with the taijutsu user's sheer speed, but he had managed it. Looking as Ino picked herself back up from the wall, he called out to her. "Ino, now!" "Right." The blonde spoke as she formed a quick succession of hand seals. Her eyes rolled to the back of her head, but she remained standing nevertheless. Shikamaru, however, then noticed something. Lee's mouth that looked like he had something in it. As Lee noticed that Shikamaru had recognized that he had something in his mouth, he spat out what it was, revealing yet another flashbang. Shikamaru's eyes widened. It was common knowledge that the shadow techniques only affected all extremities from the neck down, but he never expected his opponent to plan ahead like this. Like all scientists and strategists, he made a critical error, the error of ruling out the human element from the equation. Lee had planned ahead. Soon enough the weapon served its purpose, exploding in a bright flash and a loud bang that left their ears ringing. But worst of all, Shikamaru knew that his shadow had been disconnected to Lee. This time, being ready for the explosion, he was able to orient himself much quicker than before. He looked back to where Lee had been standing, but of course he knew that the boy wasn't there, and so wasn't surprised to find that he was right. He went to draw a kunai but paused as time seemed to slow. He realized almost like an epiphany that Lee wouldn't be aiming for him. In a split-second decision, the shadow user rushed back, towards Ino, tackling her, temporarily immobile, body to the ground as a kunai tore through his vest, and down his back. Shikamaru screamed in pain as blood gushed from the wound. Ino's eyes came back into focus, finding Shikamaru breathing heavily above her, blood flowing from his back, down his neck and dripping onto her. Grabbing him, she positioned herself so she would be kneeling, with Shikamaru resting on one of her knees as he struggled against the pain. She glanced back at Lee, who had a shallow cut on his arm where Shikamaru had tried to retaliate, swinging blindly with a kunai. The taijutsu user looked to her, a kunai in his hand as he made his way closer. Those who fight and run away, live to fight another day. The thought was a bitter thing. Thinking fast, Ino took one of her own flash bombs and as the thing went off used a quick shunshin to escape. Lee looked around for his opponents, but realized soon that they were paying them no further thought. There was still plenty more fighting to be done. Chuji grunted in pain as his form smashed against the stone wall, cracking it slightly by the sheer force with which he hit. Landing on his hands and knees, his breath came in quick pants. Everything hurt, and he wasn't anywhere near dry enough to be considered safe from those lightning axes. Picking himself up, Chuji formed his own series of hand seals, and slammed both fists, elbow deep, into the ground. Toshiro paused in his charge for a brief moment, before Chuji lifted his hands up, revealing them to be completely covered in hardened mud. The large Akimichi moved with startling speed, rushing the Kiri in with a desperate offensive. Toshiro spun his axes once before slamming them both onto the ground, sending huge lightning bolts through the earth, tearing it apart as they headed for Chuji. The Akimichi boy jumped high into the air, his trajectory bringing him closer and closer to drop right on top of Toshiro. The Kiri ninja threw one of his axes. The weapon flew with ease as well as accuracy, but Chuji merely batted it aside with one of his earth fists, ignoring the chunk that was blown off from the impact with its elemental weakness, as he raised both fists above his head. Before Toshiro could really do anything to stop him, both fists grew to incredible proportions, and were heading straight for him, intent on crushing him beneath their massive weight. The Kiri ninja ran, and he ran fast, lunging as he tried to escape the impact area. A scream of immense pain was ripped from his throat, however, as he was unable to escape in time, and one of his legs ended up beneath the very edge of Chuji's fist, pinned beneath an ungodly amount of weight. Soon Chuji's fists returned to their normal size as he landed on the floor and walked up to Toshiro. The Kiri ninja grunted in pain as he used a nearby wall to pick himself up, struggling to keep the weight off his injured leg. Chuji made his way over, ready to finish the fight before any other ninja arrived to help him. Of course, he had discounted one small factor: the axe Toshiro had thrown before. Quickly pulling and controlling the blade with chakra strings, the weapon found itself spinning through the air again, coming right back around, aiming for Chuji's back. The large Akimichi felt a slow chill crawl up his spine. Something was wrong, and he had learned to trust his instincts very early on in his life. The crackling of lightning chakra was the only warning he received. Reflexively rolling to the side, he watched in morbid, mildly sick fascination as the axe tore a huge chunk out of his upper arm. Strangely, he felt little pain the moment it happened, the pain striking him a few moments later as the lightning took its effect and sent another shock through his system, making him crumple to the ground in a heap. Then the pain in his arm hit. It now hung uselessly at his side, bleeding heavily, the red liquid dripping down from his fingers and to the cold floor beneath. Toshiro himself collapsed a moment later, not being able to hold himself up with one leg. The adrenaline that had been numbing the pain in his system was leaving him now, allowing the full effect of his injury to start taking effect. Fall back. Toshiro grunted as he looked up, finding that it was an IWA shinobi that had called out the order. He smirked as he looked back at Chuji. It appeared they succeeded in taking the northern wall. Now if he could just get a medic nin. Soon enough, though, one of the IWA Anbu appeared at Chuji's side. Akimichi-san! The man cried in alarm before motioning to others. Soon enough another Anbu appeared and they both put Chuji's arms over their shoulders, hefting him up before they ran, leaving Toshiro face down in the dirt. The Kiri ninja groaned and hoped that one of his own men would help him out soon enough. If not, well, he was certainly in here for the long run. Shino blocked a claw swipe from Kiba, kicking Inuzuka's legs out from under him before leaping straight up to avoid Atsuga from Akamaru. Kiba growled as he got back to his feet and leapt up after Shino, forming another Tsuga technique. The Aburame had formed the familiar bug-like wings on his back, using them to swerve out of the way. As Kiba came out of his technique, Shino threw a kunai, trusting Kiba's limited evasive ability in mid-air to carry the weapon to its target. Coming to the dog boy's aid, however, was Akamaru, shoving him out of the way with his own body weight. The Aburame boy judged the trajectory of their fall, launching yet another swarm of Kikaichu in their direction. Kiba snarled, getting to his feet, flexing his claws once before he slashed at the air, lightning chakra escaping his fingertips, creating something of a static shield against the incoming swarm. Shino was unfazed. Kiba growled, his animalistic features making him look almost feral as he glared at the Aburame. "Tell me, Shino, how does it feel to be licking that bastard's feet? Knowing that you sold us out just to be a slave to him." "I am no one's slave, Inuzuka-san," he replied levelly. "However, I will say it is most preferable to be the right hand of the devil than in his path." The Inuzuka boy growled before he spoke again. "Right hand of the devil, my ass? I'm gonna show you what a real devil is. Akamaru." He called his partner before he threw the dog a soldier pill. The beast's fur turned bright red, its ears standing on end as its fangs lengthened. The dog leapt up before it started spinning. Shino held his hands up, becoming disgusted as urine sprayed over his form. And people said insects were unhygienic. As the dog landed, Kiba leapt up on top of him, formed a series of quick conceals before the two were enveloped in a cloud of smoke. Shino waited for it to clear. When it did, it revealed a three-headed wolf-like dog, its fur red like blood, its eyes shining and glowing in eerie yellow. The drool that escaped its three maws bubbled and hissed like acid. "You like it? It's my own variant of my family's technique, much more powerful than the previous one." The head in the center growled out, its voice grating and bestial, not at all like Kiba's regular voice. Shino straightened his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "An improvement over your usual self, I'm sure." A faint buzzing noise reached Kiba's ears, steadily growing louder and louder. Finally, the buzzing was so loud regular individuals could hear it. "What the look out!" was the only warning Kiba received before a huge swarm, locusts like Kikaichu, flew up and over the wall, blocking out the sun with their numbers. "This is one of my ultimate techniques. It summons all my hives of Kikaichu to my aid. Soon you shall be nothing. They will devour you, in both chakra and body. Perhaps your bones shall remain. Perhaps not." The three-headed dog roared once in defiance, and tried to bite at the Aburame, only for Shino again to disperse into Kikaichu and join the swarm flying above. Kiba growled as his legs tensed, the muscles coiling back before he leapt high into the air, his form spinning and shredding through any of the bugs caught in his path, ignoring the ones that latched onto his skin, stinging, biting and tearing his flesh as he spun through the air. Temari growled as she sent another series of wind blades at the Hyuga heiress, only for the girl to see the attack with her Byakugan and avoid it entirely, continuing her headlong charge without even breaking her stride. The Wind Mistress snapped her massive fan shut before she used it as a makeshift shield to block Hinata's Juken strikes, pushing the girl off before she took to the air again, launching another attack to keep the girl from following. Hinata backflipped several times to avoid the attack before spinning around and batting away Sakura's attempted strikes with chakra scalpels. The medic Nin was fast, a tad bit faster than Hinata herself, but not enough to make any real difference. Finally, Hinata latched onto Sakura's wrists, falling back before placing both legs on the pink-haired girl's stomach and throwing her back over her. Sakura flipped in mid-air, landing on her feet before spinning around. Hinata watched as multiple chakra strings appeared from the girl's fingertips. Following them with her Byakugan, she watched as they attached themselves to numerous stones, bricks, and other pieces of rubble around her. With a strong yank, Sakura pulled the stones together, heading towards Hinata. The Hyuga girl again started spinning. Kaiten! The spinning cyclone of chakra demolished all that came near it, turning the projectile weapons into little more than particle dust. As the dome of chakra dissipated, Hinata caught sight of another shadow above her. Snapping her head in said direction, the Hyuga girl barely managed to catch sight of Temari's silhouette as the glare of the sun partially blinded her before the girl swung her fan again, sending a wave of air pressure smashing directly on top of the Hyuga girl, making her collapse onto her hands and knees. Seizing the opportunity, Sakura launched forward. A chakra scalpel formed in her hand as she moved to strike at Hinata's neck. The Hyuga girl latched onto the other girl's wrist, again, deftly avoiding the invisible blade. Sakura responded by delivering another kick to the girl's midsection, which Hinata blocked, using the force of the kick to add to her momentum, leaping up and onto the roof of a nearby building, on Iwa's side of the wall, a tad higher than the wall itself. Ignoring the shattering tiles beneath her feet, Hinata straightened, watching as Temari launched several more wind blades at her. Drawing some kunai shuriken from her pouch, she threw them, well enough to avoid the numerous little wind blades and head straight for the wind mistress. Spinning her fan in front of her, Temari blocked them all with its sheer size and weight, before she launched a second volley of wind blades at the Hyuga clan head, which Hinata avoided. Taking up her stance, the Hyuga kunoichi eyed the other two as they leapt over and landed on the rooftop she was on. They circled her slowly, inching along to each flank her. It would do little good considering she could see them regardless. She let them. Hinata. Sakura growled out, just tell me why. Why did you betray everyone to that monster? What could he have possibly offered you to do so? The Hyuga shook her head slowly. He didn't offer me anything, Sakura. I did what I had to do to save my sister and myself from my father's tyranny. The losses you suffered were regrettable, but there was no way I could have avoided them. Quite frankly, it was between your lives, against the lives of me and my sister. I simply chose the obvious path. Sakura's eyes burned with a fury she hadn't long known. You heartless bitch, do you have any idea what all of my friends, your friends, had to go through? Ino has been through hell. Kiba and his sister still can't look at a picture of their mother without tears coming to their eyes. Do you even have the slightest idea what you've put them through? Hinata closed her eyes and sighed. Like I said, it was a regrettable necessity, but if I hadn't done what I did, both my sister and myself would have had the branch family curse seal placed on us, and none of your parents would have done anything, or even cared to do anything to help us. I did what I had to do. Temari watched the exchange slowly. She wasn't sure what the branch family curse seal was, but she guessed it wasn't good. She could see both sides of the story, not having been truly involved in the events, but her loyalty was with her friends, not this stranger. Tenten and Mika each leapt away from each other, as the shredding mass of fur that was Hana's summon plowed through the area they had previously been standing on. Deep, jagged claw marks digging deeply into the cold stones. The animal barely even stopped for a scant few seconds before it lunged after Tenten, choosing to ignore Mika for now. The weapon mistress, as she continued to hang in the air from her jump, threw a kunai, a thin wire attached to the end, lodging it into one of the stones to the side before pulling herself in to avoid the attack. Hana smirked before she timed her leap from her mount, and finally lunged at the bun-haired girl, forming her own tsuga midway through her flight. Tenten, caught off guard by the attack, wasn't able to do much else other than brace herself before the blow hit her full force, smashing her against the stone floor and into buttresses of the defensive wall. Coughing up a good deal of blood, the weapon mistress picked herself up off the ground, her scratches and bruises now marring her arms and knees from the skidding impact. Hearing a crash off to the side, she watched as Hana's summon lunged towards her, its jaw wide open and ready to snap shut over her form. The bun-haired girl rolled forward, barely avoiding the creature as its jaws snapped shut, unrolling a scroll as she did. In a puff of smoke, a naginata-like weapon appeared in her hand. Getting to her feet, she tried to swipe at the side of the beast's exposed neck, but it reared back before she had the chance to complete her strike. The creature was about to bite down where she was again when it suddenly reared back, with what could only be called a screech of pain escaping its lips. Tenten was confused by this, but as the animal turned, it revealed Mika. Her blade plunged deep into the creature's back, right between the beast's massive shoulder blades. The pain must have truly been excruciating, as Tenten could hear the blade scraping against bones as the Kiri Kunoichi twisted it harshly, the smile never leaving her face. Sensing movement behind her, Tenten spun around in time to see and dodge a claw swipe from the Inuzuka girl. Lashing back, she spun the naginata with the expertise and precision of a master of years. She managed to get the Inuzuka girl to back up a decent distance. Tenten then tried several quick jabbing motions with the weapon, the tip glinting in the mid-morning sunlight as Hana dodged them with deft, equally quick movements. Finally, after another dodge, Tenten swiped at the girl's face, followed by a swing to her legs. Hana leaned back and leapt over each respectively, twirling in the air before she came down with a swipe of her claws, fire chakra trailing behind them, breaking through the weapon's hardened wood easily and digging into Tenten's shoulder, as the girl reflexively tried to block the attack. It wasn't a serious wound, but it was a painful one. Kicking Hana in the stomach hard enough to make her stumble, the weapon mistress then flipped back, unrolling another scroll and unveiling a three-piece staff. Ignoring the blood that trickled down her shirt from the recent injury, as she glared at the female Inuzuka. Guan's feet skidded back slightly as he blocked Yoshihiro's swing with his sword, the weight of the man's hammer throwing him off balance for a bit, barely giving him enough time to bring his blade back to block the follow-up strike. He momentarily saw an opening in Yoshihiro's defense, but the killing intent flared suddenly, just as he had seen it, making him hesitate, missing his opportunity, and leaving himself open in the process, allowing Yoshihiro to seize his own opening, punching the Kiri swordsman in the jaw, sending him tumbling to the floor before the Tsuchikage turned to face Kakashi. The silver-haired jounin ducked under the hammer aimed at his head before he tried to plunge a kunai into Yoshihiro's side, which was slightly exposed being that it was only covered by the leather straps of his armor. The Tsuchikage, however, caught his wrist, yanked his hand away, holding it so it was exposed, and then tried to swing his hammer down on it with his free hand. Only for Kakashi to form a sealless shadow clone to take the hit instead before he kicked Yoshihiro off, ignoring the flare of killing intent with sheer adrenaline. Yoshihiro released his grip on Kakashi's arm before he delivered a brutal straight kick to the copy nin's stomach, sending him flying across the room. Yoshihiro couldn't turn in time to block the massive blade that slammed across his back armor. Grunting in pain, he stumbled before spinning back around, swinging his hammer, aiming for Guan's legs. Kiri-nin went to jump, but Yoshihiro again flared his killing intent, intentionally this time, and again the man hesitated from the sudden fear that gripped him, managing to only leap up slightly after he caught himself. Still, the hammer slammed into his ankle, causing pain to flare up in the appendage. Kiri-nin grunted, stumbling as he landed, forcing himself to stand straight regardless, blocking the nerves with chakra manipulations to keep the injury from slowing him any further. With a yell, Yoshihiro raised the hammer high above his head before bringing it down over Guan, or at least attempting to. The man had rolled to the side quickly enough to avoid the bludgeoning weapon. Getting to his feet, he barely blocked another strike from Yoshihiro, but even so, his weapon was knocked out of his hand by the sheer force behind the older man's blow. Yoshihiro grabbed the man by his hair and slammed his face against his knee with a sickening crunch, which was soon revealed to be his nose as blood flowed freely down his face. The sound of 1,000 birds reached the Tsuchikage's ears. Yoshihiro spun around, expecting to find Kakashi with his signature Chidori technique. But as he turned around, he saw absolutely nothing. Momentarily confused, it only took him a brief moment to discover what had happened. Genjutsu. Kakashi suddenly exploded from the ground to his left, aiming to stab a kunai into his side. Judging by the trajectory, it would pierce through his ribs and into his lung. Acting fast, the older man barely managed to maneuver his body enough to change the fatal blow to a crippling one. "You're not the only one with skills in Genjutsu," the copy ninja remarked, watching as the Tsuchikage coughed up blood, and his skin returned to its natural tan tone. Hee damn kids," Yoshihiro muttered before he grabbed Kakashi's wrist with one hand. Never paying attention to the basics, not even the most important of them. "And what's that?" Kakashi questioned dangerously as he twisted the blade into the man's side harshly. Yoshihiro ignored the pain as fire and earth chakra gathered in his palm, forming what seemed like a molten fireball. A ninja is sworn to give everything to his village. His grip over Kakashi's wrist tightened, and the copy ninja's eyes widened as he realized what the older man was thinking. Especially his life. The Sandaime Tsuchikage roared before he slammed the fireball into the floor at his feet. The battle outside was drawn to a sudden, dreaded pause as the force field covering the building that had been holding off all ninja from rushing to the place where they each knew their respective commanders to be was enveloped in a massive, fiery explosion, the shockwave of which knocked many off their feet and even made the wall itself shake from the intensity. As one, both armies rushed to the scene, each silently declaring a momentary ceasefire, desperate to learn the fate of their respective leaders. The sight that greeted them was disheartening to both sides. Two of Konoha's legends, Hatake Kakashi and Tatsuoki Guan, were face down among the wooden debris, several third and second degree burns covering their exposed skin. Both unmoving. With Iwa, the sight of their beloved Sandaime Tsuchikage, a man that had been the one immovable mountain of strength and charisma above all others, was more crippling to them than any physical injury. Many hardened veterans felt tears beginning to form behind their eyes, which they desperately tried to hold back, but failed despite their efforts. Suddenly, a cough brought all of the ninja within earshot out of their respective stupors before leaping down, hoping that it was one of their leaders that had been the one to cough. Numerous cries of Yoshihiro-sama, "Hatake-san!" and "Master Guan!" cut through the air as each of them rushed to the fallen warriors. Hinata broke through the crowd, activating her, and watched that the chakra flow within the two Konoha jounin was still flowing. She sighed in relief. They were both unconscious. Looking to Yoshihiro, as several of his umbu helped the man stand, hefting his arms over their shoulders, she was tempted to order the attack. But looking back at her own men, beaten and battered as they were, she held back, considering the pros and cons to her men's morale. If she declared an attack now, the IWA Nin would fight back tooth and nail without a second thought to their own safety in order to save their beloved Sandaime. Her soldiers wouldn't fight as hard and would surely be pushed back. Now was the time to hold back. They would be able to come back on another occasion, when the full vulnerability of their leader would sink into the IWA ninja, making their morale plummet. That's enough fighting for today. Hinata spoke, her voice strong as she looked the older man dead in the eye. Let both sides pull back for now. We don't attack you and you don't attack us. Yoshihiro chuckled dryly, ignoring the blood that dribbled down his lower lip as he slowly nodded. That sounds good to me, girl. Hinata watched as Kiba stepped forward snarling before he was held back by his sister, lip reading the older girl. She managed to see what she was saying rather easily. Let it go, now's not the time, little bro, just let it go. We'll have our chance to gut her before this is done. Slowly, tensely both armies began dispersing, each eyeing the other warily. No cheers of victory were cried out that night. Later that night, Yoshihiro lay, injured on the cot of their temporary hospital, many of his trusted ninja all standing around him. The medic Nins here, including that Suna girl Sakura, had done a remarkable job of patching him up. Oh sure, he could still feel the soreness, aches, dull and sharp pains. But the fact that he wasn't dead was certainly something to be grateful for. It was his armor. The heavy bulky piece of shit had actually saved him, absorbed much of the kinetic energy of the blast, and absorbing the subsequent impact. If it wasn't for that, he would have probably had much of his insides like goo and his ribs turning his lungs into Swiss cheese. He would imagine that Kakashi and Guan were not so lucky. They may have survived the blast, sure, but they would most likely never be in any real condition to fight as quickly as he would. In about 2 days he'd be back to his 70%, he estimated. The old man's thoughts were interrupted, however, as a cough, one of the many he had been suppressing, escaped his lips in his now weakened state, racking his form violently. Yoshihiro-sama. Many of the Jounins called. Do you want us to call another of the medics? Waving their frantic cries of worry off, he grunted as his coughing finally ceased. Knock off, bring in those Sunanin in here, eh? Right away, sir. One of the men spoke before he stood and walked out the door. A few moments later, each of the aforementioned Suna ninja was in the room with him. He looked them over once before he slowly began to clap. Each of the standing ninja looked at one another confused before they awaited his explanation. Well, I'm impressed. Plenty of those field reports say that many of you handled yourselves exceptionally well against the main Konoha commanders you faced. Quite impressive. You've been reading and listening to reports? Sakura almost shouted. With all due respect, Sachikage-sama, you're in no condition to. Hush, girl. Yoshihiro interrupted sternly. I know very well what my limitations are, and a few reports won't kill me. Besides, fearing death at my age is just plain old stupid. The Pinkette still looked uncomfortable but nodded nonetheless. Yoshihiro looked like he was about to say something else when an IWA Chunin burst through the door. Yoshihiro-sama. A large ninja force from IWA is approaching. What? Yoshihiro spoke startled, before he looked at Sakura. Girl, fetch me something I can use to stand with. You're going to. Now, child. Yoshihiro interrupted again, this time more firmly. He appreciated her concern, but god damn it, he was 77 years old, and no wet behind the ears medic from Suna no less was going to tell him what he could and could not do. Sakura bit back a curse before she stalked outside the door, grabbed the nearest cane and walked back in, handing it to the Tsuchikage. Yoshihiro grunted as his men helped him get to his feet, and used the cane to support himself as he made his way out the hospital and towards the gate. Finally, a few minutes and stumbles later, in which Sakura insisted he let her get him a wheeled chair, the old man finally arrived at the gate. Only to come across the sight of his nephew. Tohisa? Yoshihiro questioned. What are you doing here? The young Shimizu bowed. My lord, our men refuse to simply sit by any longer and allow you to face this threat on your own. We have come to fight at your side. Yoshihiro looked as all the Chunin and Jounin behind his nephew bowed lowly before they stood up straight again, saluting him. What are your orders, Tsuchikage-sama? Yoshihiro looked over at the gathered crowd, a smile forming over his lips before he allowed his eyes to land over to Ohisa again. You just didn't want to handle all the paperwork, huh? The younger man actually smiled and winked. Yoshihiro guffawed loudly before he enveloped his nephew in a fierce hug. Fine then. Men, prepare yourselves. In 2 days' time, we shall strike at Konoha's camp, and drive them out of Iowa for good. What do you say to that? His answer was the great roar of his men's cheers. Hinata watched as Kakashi and Guan were settled into the medic ward. The diagnostic was not looking good at all. Kakashi had 3 broken ribs, a broken femur in his left leg, a punctured lung and a broken hip bone. Guan had a ruptured spleen, several small cracks along his skull, a broken ankle, a hip bone fractured in several places, with the bone fragments causing even more internal damage as well as a severe case of internal bleeding. Obviously both were in critical condition. Shino walked up silently behind her. It appears that Yoshihiro-san has defeated us yet again. Hinata nodded slowly. Indeed, she sighed as she rubbed her forehead. He's not going to like this. Indeed, but we must still inform him. Yoshihiro is simply far more than we could handle, and my Kakashi tells me that he will soon be again ready for battle. Jesus, that man, he's a devil. Shino finished for her. I can see where he got his namesake. Naruto sat at his desk, going over the forms of a new trade agreement they were setting up with the Land of Waves. It was a tedious process of political negotiations, but Naruto knew that they were all necessary, dreadfully so. He finished reading over one of the forms when a messenger bird suddenly flew into the balcony, perching itself on his desk. Grabbing the small scroll around its ankle, he unrolled it and allowed his eyes to pass over the encoded message. The blonde ninja took a deep breath before opening his eyes again and calmly reached for the intercom. Suzum. He called his secretary. Yes, Naruto-sama? A slight pause. Cancel all known appointments. When do I reappoint them then? She questioned, hiding her shock at the sudden request. Inform everyone that all appointments are cancelled until further notice. He answered again, removing his hand from the button, though he could still hear her startled screech of what, from clear down the hall. When Suzum entered through the door, however, she found that her Hokage was already long gone. His pace brisk and determined, the blonde seemed like a specter as he flew through the halls of his home, throwing the sliding doors to his armory wide open before he entered, walking towards the end of it where it revealed a metal container. Kneeling down, he undid the metallic locks, and ran his blood over the seal over the chest before opening it. He looked over the familiar contents, the same items that had not seen action in nearly a decade. He had them refitted and remolded so they could fit his current body structure many times over the years, but other than that, they were still the same. He let his eyes travel over them, before his hands slowly reached for the first one. Chapter 47, The Siege of Sakai, Akisho. 2 days since the Second Battle of Sakai. One of the guards currently on duty around Konoha's main encampment for the siege was startled as he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder. Looking back behind him, he found Toshiro, the axe-wielding Kiri ninja, standing behind him. The young Jounin gave a nod of consent as he watched the man lose some of his tension, the muscles in his arms and legs uncoiling as he allowed himself to drop his guard and place the kunai he had reflexively grabbed back into its proper holster. Go get some rest, it's my shift now. The guard nodded yes, sir. He spoke respectfully before he inclined his head in a slight bow. Toshiro sat down, preparing for the long shift, trying not to think of the wounded state of his father. While he knew that his father was not invincible, it was still very disheartening to see him so injured. His father was one of the strongest men he knew, after all. He let his eyes travel to the sky above, judging by the coming dawn. Orange and purple hues decorating the horizon over Iwa's jagged peaks. He could assume that it was somewhere between 5:30 and 6. He would have a shift until about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, where the next person would take up the shift. The crisp morning air, blanketed with the deep morning fog from the high mountains. Toshiro wasn't really used to fog. Mist was moist and could be warm in the right conditions. Fog had a more dry feeling, more humid, and was just downright cold. The young Jounin oftentimes wondered how the IWA shinobi could deal with it at this altitude. Though he must admit it must do wonders for endurance training. The air was much thinner here than what it was in Kiri, meaning that their endurance could easily be halved if they didn't know how to deal with such an environment. Most of the ninja that were assigned to this assault had received a crash course in breathing and minor chakra control techniques to assist them in managing the thin air while their bodies adjusted properly. Toshiro slowly sat back, leaning his head against the wall. For the last 2 days, there had been little activity on both sides of the wall, both merely patrolling their respective lines and making sure no one tried to pull one thing over the other's eyes. But, as Toshiro sat around for a bit longer, he noticed that just beyond the morning fog faint, shadowy silhouettes could be seen. His eyes narrowed as he slowly stood, forcing his eyes to pierce through the ghostly veil. As the sun rose over the hills, and light descended down, dispelling the shadows, Toshiro's eyes widened as he came across the sight of what must have been nearly the entire IWA army. Over the wall, and practically at their doorstep. He looked to the other guard towers and scouting points, finding IWA shinobi at them instead. He could even see the slightly distinguished forms of what seemed like gray lumps, possibly bodies near them. Sensing a presence behind him, he reacted instantly. Turning, and fluidly catching knife and wrist, the attacker had been aiming for his kidneys, judging by the angle his hand was at. Pulling the man forward, Kirinin delivered a quick elbow to the man's throat, listening to his gag, before he delivered another elbow to the man's extended forearm, listening to it give a sickening snap. The man choked on his own scream before Toshiro delivered another backhand across his face, knocking him to the floor as his mask cracked. Taking out one of his axes, he plunged it into the ninja's chest as he was down, snapping his rib bones with the force behind his blow. The man gave a single jerk before he fell limp. Toshiro cursed before immediately rushing off to sound the alarm. IWA had caught them with their pants down. Definitely not a good thing. Yoshihiro smirked, watching the young Kiri ninja flee the scene. So we weren't able to get them all then. Not a moment later, bells were rung throughout the leaf camp before them. He pulled the scope from his eyes. Looking to his jounin next to him, he spoke up. Well, they aren't just gonna commit suicide for ya. Move! He yelled out the order so that it was carried over the assembled group of ninja, and in silence they all vanished. A moment later, cries were heard coming from the Konoha camp, the sound of metal clashing against metal following shortly behind. He smirked, letting his eyes travel to Temari and Toyohisa. The two had remained behind, acting as bodyguards to make sure no one else attempted any other assassinations. You two really should join the battle. Surprise attacks are good for you. Seeing the enemy get out of their tents, confused, disoriented, and sometimes but naked is certainly not a sight you'll get to see many times. Temari's nose wrinkled in distaste at the joke. No thank you, guarding an old man is just fine by me. She shot back, smirking at Yoshihiro's snort. Toyohisa shook his head. Uncle, you know very well that I didn't even want to bring you out into the field. I sure as hell am not going to leave you here alone for any other attempt on your life to be carried out. Yoshihiro shook his head and was about to tell his mother hen of a nephew that he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself, when pressure built up in his chest and he released a hacking cough, placing a fist over his mouth as he tried to suppress more coughs as they flowed up from his lungs. After about 10 seconds, Temari started to get a bit concerned, placing a hand on the older man's armored back. Hey, are you alright? Uncle? Toyohisa questioned. I cough fine. The older man managed to gasp out unconvincingly as more coughs escaped his lips, becoming violent as he hunched forward, placing his free hand to grasp Toyohisa in order to hold himself up. Hey, Toyohisa-san, I think we need to get him back to the medics or something. Temari cried out in alarm as the older man's coughing got visibly worse, and he actually sounded like he was hacking up something a lot redder than mucus. Yoshihiro fell to one knee, Temari and Toyohisa grabbing him by his armpits to stop him from falling completely. Finally, after almost another 30 seconds of the older man's violent coughing, it finally died down, allowing both the Tsuchikage and the other two to breathe easier. Uncle, Toyohisa began uncertainly. You haven't been taking your medication, have you? Medication? Temari thought in silent question, having never heard, or having any inclination at the older man having any condition that required medication. Yoshihiro glared at his loose-tongued nephew before standing. No, I haven't. Those damn cough pills of yours cloud the mind, make me drowsy. Can't afford that in a battle. But the younger man moved to protest when Yoshihiro grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt, pulling him so they were face to face. The old man spoke firmly, and with an edge of graveness to his voice, but with an underlying hint of softness. This is a battlefield in Tohisa. You just think of the enemies around and in front of you. You can worry about my carcass later, got it? Slowly the younger man nodded and Yoshihiro released him. Looking to Temari, he sent her a silent glare, asking for her to remain very quiet. Catching the older man's look, she understood it, and decided it was the interest of her health insurance if she did as he wished. Hinata screamed out a curse as a kunai sliced open the back of her knee, thrown from one of the passing IWA nin. Growling as her knee gave out, she blocked the incoming strike from another ninja with one hand, delivered a quick palm thrust to the man's stomach with her other, forcing him to cough up blood. Then she used the same hand to grab one of the kunai from his pouch. The ninja behind her at this point had tossed another kunai, this one aiming for the back of her head. She spun around, throwing her newly acquired kunai at her long-range attacker while simultaneously placing a minor over it, his kunai and hers passing right by each other. Catching the kunai aimed at her, she watched as the man tried to do the same, only to see his features twist into one of shock and horror as the kunai sliced open his throat. Spinning back around, she plunged the kunai in her hands, upwards into the other man's jaw, watching him give a quick jerk before he fell dead. The Hyuga heir cursed again as she performed what little medical abilities she had over her wounded leg. She had barely fallen asleep 3 hours ago, having been going over the battle plans with Shino, Tenten and Mika. They were scheduled to attack the IWA ninja tomorrow, near dusk. She had not expected IWA would ever launch an attack. Their Tsuchikage was injured, and if the condition of Guan and Kakashi was anything to go by, he wouldn't be back in fighting condition for at least another month. Judging by how strong Yoshihiro was, losing him, even just temporarily, would be an utterly demoralizing blow to the IWA ninja. Everyone knows that an army whose morale is low is not one that can lead an attack with a great chance of success. They must be desperate to drive them back. And as Naruto had sometimes said, desperation breeds determination. She had made the critical error of underestimating them, and it was costing her. She was merely armed with a single kunai pouch, being the only thing she had been able to put on, and it was no surprise many ninja were in a similar condition. Finishing her healing technique, she moved to stand, growling as her knee shook in weakness as it struggled to hold her upright. She could not afford any handicap, especially one this damning, at this point so early in the battle. Her Byakugan flared and immediately she caught sight of a very familiar ninja. Leaping back, she fell to one knee as she landed. A spinning, shredding cyclone crashing down onto the spot she had been standing on a few minutes earlier. The dust soon cleared, revealing the snarling Kiba, though he held the hints of a smirk on his lips. Heh, no bug-loving freak to save you now, eh? Who says I need saving from a mongrel like you? Hinata shot back in a bored tone, but carried an edge to it. Whether that was from anger, or from worry due to her injury wasn't really known. A voice behind her startled her, however. That would be me. Hinata spun around, barely managing to catch a scant glimpse of another spinning form before it smashed into her at a downward angle. Her arm, which had taken the full brunt of the impact, released a sickening snap as claws slashed it open, rivulets of blood pouring out. Hinata screamed bloody murder, pain racing up and down her arm. She did manage to notice, however, that by the angle her attacker came from, they had used the Byakugan's blind spot to get in that close. She had gotten careless yet again. The fact that no one had used that weakness against her during the recent battles had led her to believe no one in Iowa knew about it, and the fact that Kiba, Sakura, or that other blonde-haired girl she had fought had used it had also led her to believe none of the Konoha refugees knew about it either. Another foolish mistake on her part, especially using Kiba of all people to compare the rest of the Konoha nuns that were here. The attack had sent her in Kiba's direction. The Inuzuka boy's hands reared back as he prepared to tear her open with the sharp, natural weapons that were his claws. Fighting through the pain, she righted herself in midair, catching the boy's upward slash with her one good arm, blocking the other with her left leg, and driving her right foot into the boy's throat, kicking both him and herself away, as she used him to gain leverage to back flip so she landed on her feet. While she was in midair, however, another form suddenly exploded from the ground that was previously beneath Kiba. Hinata's eyes widened as she came across the sight of a second Kiba, no doubt Akamaru, as he lunged for her, claws extended. Spinning around quickly, the familiar, signature barrier of her clan formed around her. Kaiten! Akamaru's henge dispelled as the animal was forcefully thrown away, the creature's sharp yelp reaching the ears of those within earshot as he scraped and skidded to a stop on the harsh gravel covering the floor. Hinata groaned from the stress placed on her injured arm. As the barrier around her dissipated, however, she caught sight of Hana, behind her, a kunai already aimed to strike at her ribs. Hinata struggled to turn, knowing already that it was too late, but refusing to accept defeat lying down. Hana smirked, certain of the girl's death, and at least a part of their revenge being accomplished, when Hinata suddenly vanished, and she felt her wrist caught in an iron, unyielding grip. Cursing, the Inuzuka girl froze as her eyes found red and black before her eyes. The slight click as the hand, clad in a metallic, segmented gauntlet, tightened its already powerful grip on her wrist brought her back. Slowly her eyes traveled up, to the form that towered above her. Blood-red cloak billowing in the cold, harsh wind of the high mountains. A sharp, metal face mask covered the bottom half of his features, while the veiled shadow, formed by the hood of his cloak, covered the other half. Burning red eyes stared back into her own as they glowed eerily from the darkness. Hana growled, hiding the fear gripping her chest as she stared upon this man after a decade, behind a veil of anger, a much more secure emotion by comparison. Kiba's eyes widened, and for a moment, all seemed to freeze, holding itself perfectly still at the sight of him. Hinata, from her place on the ground, gasped when she saw him. Her commander, clad in his old battle garb. It had been nearly a full 7 years since she had last seen the imposing sight of him in that armor. She had to admit, it was somewhat strange, bringing both relief and unease. Hana growled as she slashed with her other hand, a trail of chakra flowing from her claw tips, heading for his face. Naruto released her wrist, and with the same arm blocked her incoming strike, meeting his fist with her forearm. Hana screamed as the tough bone was cracked, the sickening sound reaching Naruto's ears. He followed up his attack, with one powerful blow to the young woman's chest. Hana froze for a moment, before she coughed up blood, hunching over as she fell to her knees, blood escaping her lips and pooling beneath her. Naruto faintly heard a horn being blown in the distance but paid little attention to it. "Sis!" Kiba cried out in fear and alarm before he snarled, rushing the hooded ninja in a blind fury. Naruto looked over his shoulder, red eyes glowing eerily as he spoke. "Worthless." Hinata's eyes traveled down to his hand, widening in alarm as a familiar ball of chakra formed and spun rapidly in his right hand, red creeping over it before it burst into flame. "Get back!" she cried to all within earshot before she herself used Shunshin in her attempt to get as far away from the area as possible. Yoshihiro's eyes snapped open as he stood up, a slow feeling of dread creeping down his spine as a chakra, controlled, but certainly powerful, reached his highly tuned senses. Tohisa turned, sensing the distress in his uncle, something that was very odd. "Uncle, what's wrong?" he questioned, watching as Temari tensed and placed a hand on her fan as she too sensed the heaviness that settled over the air. "Tohisa." The older man spoke slowly, pausing as he weighed his next words. "Call the troops back." The young Shimizu looked visibly startled as he spoke. What? "But uncle, we have the ad." "I said call them back, don't argue." The Tsuchikage roared, knowing that now was not the time for his inexperienced nephew's premature assumptions of their victory. Tohisa unconsciously stepped back before he nodded once, vanishing in a cloud of smoke, and a second later the horn for the retreat call was blown, and in a scant few seconds IWA ninja began rushing towards them, most visibly confused and outraged at being ordered to retreat when they held the Konoha ninja at such a key disadvantage. "Tsuchikage-sama!" one of the Umbu cried out as he landed in front of him. "What is the meaning of this?" As if waiting for the man's question, a huge explosion shook the ground beneath their feet, and flames roared to life as they engulfed a wide area within the outer city. Buildings crumbled and glasses shattered as the shockwave passed over them. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed as dust and debris was kicked up, some scant few particles and pebbles smacking against his face as most of the ninja's cries of shock and alarm. "That is," Yoshihiro answered rhetorically as Tohisa appeared next to him, visibly shaken from the degree of destruction that occurred so unexpectedly. "Tohisa." The older man spoke calmly. "Take the men in retreat, pull them back behind the wall, I'll stay and act as the rear guard." "No, uncle." The young man spoke. "Let me, I will stay and you lead the men, you're still too. I'm old, you're young." End of discussion. Tohisa. Yoshihiro interrupted again, not giving the young man more time to speak. Soon enough, however, next to Temari, Sakura, Shikamaru, Ino, and Shuji soon appeared. Each in a puff of smoke and each visibly confused over the situation. "What's going on?" Ino questioned her fellow blonde. Temari shook her head. "I'm not entirely sure, but we're pulling back for now." Looking around, she spoke slowly. "Where's Kiba and Hana?" Their question was answered, however, as Akamaru landed next to them. Hana hunched over, holding on to Kiba, and Kiba himself, draped over his dog's back, burns covering much of their forms. Hana was visibly struggling to even keep herself upright. "Hana!" Sakura cried worriedly at the sight of the older girl so injured. Rushing over, the group helped them get off of Akamaru. Ino and Temari, who were grabbing Kiba, froze, not due to the sheer amount of blood covering his body, or all the burns sustained by the Inuzuka, but by the fact that his right arm was no longer there. From the shoulder down, Kiba was missing his right arm. The two blondes glanced at each other, their gazes filled with a shock and pit forming at the bottom of their stomachs. They both knew that at this point, Kiba's career as a ninja was undoubtedly over. The others, who had also noticed Kiba's dismemberment, by now barely caught the sound of Hana's strained voice as it was breathed from between the older girl's lips. "It's him, cough, he's here!" she wheezed out, nearly falling over as Sakura all but held her up. The others looked confused for a brief moment before a dawning realization settled over their eyes. Then, another explosion shook the ground at their feet, the heat making them wince in discomfort as it bit at their skin. "Go Tohisa!" They heard Yoshihiro bark, looking at the older man. They watched as the young man nodded before he turned and began barking out orders. His voice faded out into the background, however, as Yoshihiro turned to them, an understanding passing between their eyes as the IWA shinobi did as instructed and rushed back over the wall, a scant few remaining behind to act as the rear guard. They looked to the roaring wall of flames, a distance away, watching, waiting for the opponent they each knew was coming. They saw a shadowed figure slowly making its way through the fire, each tensing as the orange and red heat obscured his form. To their surprise, however, an IWA Umbu came stumbling out, holding the bleeding stump of his arm, his face mask shattered, the mouthpiece hanging by a small black strap around his neck. Blood flowed down from his forehead, covering his face in the red liquid as he stumbled towards them, his eyes wide with fear as he looked around, seemingly disoriented or looking for someone, or something. Bumping against buildings, debris, and overall junk, they could faintly hear the man muttering something, the words becoming clear as he neared them. Akisho. Akisho, he repeated as he tripped over himself, rushing to get to the Tsuchikage, the one man who could help him, who could defend him from the monstrosity that was behind him. Temari watched the man approach, but soon her eyes drifted back to the flames, watching them flicker for a split second. Her eyes widened as she saw what caused it. "Get down!" she screamed out, but the man either didn't hear her, or was simply too delirious to register the command. As if sensing his approaching fate, however, he turned sluggishly, his face contorting in fear and horror for a brief second before he was cut to several hundred pieces by what was most likely an equal number of wind blades. His blood and innards exploding over the area. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed at the display, having barely noticed where the attack came from. Once again, a shadowed figure appeared, morphing out of the flames like a specter, the harbinger of their deaths, several more shadows soon appearing at his sides, the red hood and mask becoming visible as multiple yellow eyes glowed next to him, the silhouettes of their slithering bodies becoming visible soon after. Yoshihiro gritted his teeth, taking hold of his war hammer before he stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the scarlet-covered ninja before him. "Stay calm, boys, he's human just like the rest of us. Charge in and take him down." "Yes, Tsuchikage-sama." The Umbu guard that had remained collectively spoke before they each drew their blades, rushing forward. Naruto stepped past the flames, his form now fully visible, obscured only by the slight distortions in the air caused by the heat. Looking back behind him, he grunted before he looked in front of him, extending his hand in the direction of the enemy. Receiving their master's signal, hundreds of snakes, almost 3 times the size of a man, rushed forward, their hissing and screeching easily carrying themselves over the roar of the flames as they tore into the IWA ninja. Snapping jaws, piercing fangs, and powerful tails smashing their ranks apart. Fire and water techniques are easily deflected by scales stronger than steel. Earth, lightning, and wind, easily evaded with sheer speed, belying their huge size. tearing men in half with a single snap of their jaws, crushing them beneath their weight, gold eyes flashing menacingly as they searched out their next target before they even killed their current one. Naruto ignored the chaos around him, however, his blood-red eyes trained on just one individual, who seemed just as impassive to the battle as he was. That was his target. Far behind the roaring flames, the Konoha ninja all stood, over the rooftops, getting as high as possible in order to see beyond the flames and towards the battle now taking place. There was confusion amongst most of the rookies in regards to who this man was, but that confusion was quickly dispelled by others who confirmed the man's identity. Many of the younger generation, those of 14, 15, 16 and so on, watched the battle with rapt attention. They had heard stories, tales of the sheer force of nature that this man was said to be, told by their parents to get them to behave. Each of them wanted to see the legend that was Konoha's Akisho, the Devil King, the man that could supposedly not be killed, up close and personal. And this was their best chance to see it, without being at the wrong end of the line. Hinata watched on silently. It had been so long since she felt such heaviness in the air she had almost forgotten. She had expected for his skills to have somewhat dulled, having been behind a desk for the last 7 years. But he had certainly proved her wrong. His chakra, his mere presence was 10 times as oppressive, 10 times as intense as it had been before. She swallowed her sudden fear, but did not turn away. Whether the fear was of Naruto, or for him, she was not certain. She could never be certain with him. Never know whether she served him out of loyalty and respect, or simple fear. He always treated her and all of those he knew fairly, and with the respect each of them deserved. But here on the field of battle, he changed. It was an obvious change, yet a subtle one as well. And no matter what side of the line you were on, the heaviness in the air was all the same, just as oppressive, and just as fear-inducing. Akamaru whined as he prodded the unconscious Kiba with its snout. The boy remained unconscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow as Sakura and Ino worked on closing the injury. The massive dog turned its head and growled at the sight of the red-clad man, easily recognizing him as the one who had harmed his master. Teeth flashed as he let loose a howl of fury and rushed into the fray. Hana's eyes widened, yelling as best she could with her broken ribs causing her more pain by the use of her lungs. Akamaru, stop! The beast ignored her, however, rushing past ninja and snake alike, dodging and weaving between fangs, masses of flesh, bones and jaws. It was like tunnel vision, his only target being the man in red. Powerful jaw muscles coiling beneath fur-covered skin as he prepared to snap down onto the man's head with as much crushing force as he could manage, which would easily be enough to make it explode like a melon. The beast's movement was brought to a sudden and brutal halt, however. It choked, releasing a strangled whine. Naruto's fingers tightened around the animal's throat. His voice was apathetic as he spoke. Worthless. Before he threw the dog to the side, its head smashing against a brick wall with a sickening crack, blood slowly forming a pool where its head fell on the floor, the red liquid easily mingling with others around it. Damn you! Ino suddenly roared before she too rushed into the fight. No, wait, Ino! You troublesome woman! Chuji and Shikamaru called after her before they too ran. Temari watched each of them go, keeping her head in the fight and not allowing her emotions of fear, of both the individual approaching them, and for her friends to cloud her mind. She was willing to wait for the right time, when he was distracted, in which to strike. Hana felt her stomach lurch at the sight of her brother's longtime companion get tossed aside so callously. She grit her teeth, fighting against the pain burning through her chest as she looked to their pink-haired medic who had just finished stopping the blood flow from Kiba's arm. Sakura, she called the girl. Yeah? Sakura questioned back as she moved to her side, already running a diagnostic over the older Kunoichi. Wincing silently at the damage. 3 snapped ribs, with 4 more cracked ones. Luckily, even with all the movement the Inuzuka girl did, none had punctured a lung. She was about to order the older Inuzuka to pull back and retreat with the rest of the IWA shinobi when Hana's voice interrupted her. Sakura, I need you to repair my ribs. The young pink-haired medic looked back to Hana seriously. I can't do that here. That sort of procedure is extremely delicate. You have to isolate the bone fragments, make sure the marrow doesn't reach your bloodstream, make sure the bones themselves don't shred your insides. Not to mention the pain would be almost unbearable without morphine or something similar. This isn't something that can be done in the... You either do it now and get me well enough to fight that monster, or you don't do it and I fight him anyway. The woman ground out through her teeth, wiping some blood from her mouth. Sakura shook her head. I don't even know a medical technique advanced enough to do this procedure here. You need the proper facilities. Bullshit! Hana roared as best she could, smelling the lie on the younger girl. Sakura cursed. She did know a technique Chiyo-bie-sama and herself had come up with. It combined medical chakra and puppeteer artistry. They would channel healing techniques into the body through chakra strings, and use those strings as little feelers to repair damage or snap bones back into place with precision. It was truly a brilliant piece of work, and both Sakura and Chiyo were currently looking for a way to apply it into an offensive technique that would be able to destroy the insides of the person instead. But it was difficult, because chakra strings themselves were a brittle thing at best and needed complete and total compliance from whatever it was they were trying to move, hence why they were only used in inanimate objects, which offered no resistance except that of their own weight to any proposed movement. Still, Sakura knew that using this technique, which when it began to take effect would be extremely painful, on a live patient would be difficult unless Hana moved as little as humanly possible. She could end up doing even more damage than what she already possessed if she moved around too much. Still, the girl looked determined, so Sakura nodded hesitantly. Fine, but you have to remain perfectly still no matter what. The Inuzuka girl nodded before she took a deep breath, and braced herself as green gathered around Sakura's hands. Naruto's slow trek through the chaotic, fiery battlefield around him was brought to a sudden halt as a shadow connected with his own, his eyes glancing down slowly, following the blackish trail to its owner, a face he could easily recognize as the son of Shirkato. Nara, he whispered as his chakra slowly started to spike. Shikamaru breathed heavily, sweating in exertion as he felt as if he was holding back a hurricane with an umbrella. Never in his life has he ever felt such a sheer magnitude of power. He wasn't even sure how much longer he would stand if he kept this up. Soon enough, however, there was a blur of movement next to the red ninja, and a kunai moved to pierce the very center of his chest. Before it could, however, Jinchuriki's eyes flashed a deep shade or red before his killing intent soared. Shikamaru lost control of his shadow technique, the thin tendril retracting to the shadow user who fell to his knees, along with many of the IWA shinobi around them, turning them into even easier targets for the snakes still feasting over their corpses. Ino, who was closest to the man, felt the full force of the powerful wave of killing intent. She collapsed, her stomach contents spilling to the ground at their feet, her eyes momentarily losing their focus as she fought to retain her consciousness. A knee was planted firmly in her face, sending her falling onto her back in a daze. Ino! It was the cry of worry that reached Naruto's ears. Glancing up, he found a massive fist, nearly twice his 6'3" size, heading straight for him. Holding out his hand, the blonde didn't even form hand seals before he spoke as Chuji's hand was about to reach him. Futon, Shoha! A shockwave tore through the area, buildings collapsed, the ground shook at their feet. The dazed Ino was easily blown away by the attack, Temari barely reaching her in time to catch her. The shockwave of compressed air vibrated up Chuji's arm. The sheer air pressure exerted by it was enough to slow his fist to a near-crawling pace, barely managing to feel the cloth of the Devil King's red cloak before the sounds of crunching and snapping bones tore through the air. Chuji's eyes widened before he howled in agony, his technique dispelling itself as he clutched his now thoroughly broken arm. Several of the shattered masses of calcium piercing out of his skin, blood flowing down his limb and dripping off his limp fingertips. Naruto's hand returned to his side, before he again continued on his singular path towards the Tsuchikage, who still stood silently at the other end of the road. Dai Kamakachi! Temari yelled out, swinging her fan in a wide arc, sending hundreds of tiny spinning wind blades towards Naruto, hoping the attack would at least distract him enough for someone else to take any opening he might leave. Just before the attack connected, the 20-year-old Kage vanished, allowing the tiny crescent-like blades to cut apart one of the snake summons behind him, the creature vanishing a moment later in a puff of smoke. Temari felt a cold chill run down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as her highly trained ears picked up the faint sound of breathing behind her. Her eyes barely caught the edges of his red coat from her peripheral vision. She drew a kunai, and in a lightning-fast motion tried to swipe at him. Only for Naruto to backhand her across the face, sending her tumbling to the floor, her fan knocked out of her fingers and disorienting vertigo settling over her mind. Naruto drew a kunai, rearing his arm back as he prepared to throw it and end the kunoichi's life, when something gripped his wrist firmly. Slowly he turned his head to find the form that towered over even his own. The smirk over Yoshihiro's face was one that spoke of confidence. There was still a veiled uncertainty within it. "Now that's not very nice," he said before he quickly formed a fireball in his free hand, smashing it into the blonde's chest. Shikamaru, who had been watching from a bit of a distance, was forced to cover his eyes as another explosion sent dust and debris flying through the air. A blackish blur flew from the dust, smashing into a building with bone-breaking force. As the dust around the initial area settled, it revealed Yoshihiro, looking towards the area where Naruto had been blown into, his gaze serious as he unsheathed his hammer. Soon enough Shikamaru regained his bearings and made his way back to the Tsuchikage, Chuji joining him a moment later along with Temari and Ino, the Wind Mistress being supported by the other kunoichi as she had not yet recovered from the brutal hit she had taken. "You didn't get him, did you?" Shikamaru questioned after a moment of brief silence. "If I did, I'd be very disappointed." The Tsuchikage spoke with a partially false bravado as he smirked. "I wouldn't," Temari groaned, rubbing her head in pain. A crash brought their attention back into the opening in the building as the crimson-clad body emerged, a single blade held loosely at his side as he stepped over the shifting debris at his feet. Yoshihiro eyed the burn on the boy's body armor, slightly below the ribs. He could faintly see through it, to the skin, which was healing rapidly. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed. That would most certainly be a problem judging by the near regenerative speed it was healing at. Naruto's red eyes passed over each of them as he stepped forward, calling out 3 specific names as he approached. Nara, Yamanaka, Akimichi. He sidestepped another attack from behind, allowing his attacker to pass him and land near the group of assembled ninja, revealing Hana, Sakura appearing next to the group a moment later as well as she formed another healing technique over Chuji's arm. Inuzuka, he finished, before his wrist twitched, and flames formed over the entire length of the blade in his hand. He stopped, the group surrounding him in a semicircle. "Isn't this a somewhat familiar setting?" "Don't expect it to have the same outcome," Hana snarled. Naruto's shoulders rose in a shrug. "It won't. I killed them quickly." Juga Liang slowly unrolled the scroll delivered to him by his scout, his eyes traveling over the kanji within with a measured patience, as he did with all the scrolls in his library, the same one they were currently standing in. "I see, so he is in IWA." Then he handed the scroll back to the scout and spoke. "Very well, tell the O to assemble the men, then find Yujito and Akina. They are to be ready to march tomorrow along with everyone else." "Very well, Reikage-sama." The man spoke before he vanished in a puff of smoke. Juga Liang then walked over to the balcony, watching the sun as it rose above the horizon. "Uzumaki Naruto, you have made your first mistake, and this one shall cost you more than just your village." Thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun with this epic what if as I did creating it. Make sure to smash the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a single twist in the story. Drop your thoughts, theories, or even your wildest ideas in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're craving more awesome Naruto content, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel, because there's plenty more heat waiting for you. Until next time, stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember, even a shadow clone needs love. Peace out.